The Night Lords, once the 8th Legion of Space Marines, were forged during the first founding. However, they would ultimately betray the Emperor of Mankind during the Horus Heresy in the early 31st millennium, joining the ranks of the 9 traitor legions of Chaos Space Marines. Distinct from many of the other traitor legions, the Night Lords do not pledge their loyalty to any of the 4 major Chaos gods individually. Instead, they follow the creed of Chaos Undivided, leveraging the power of terror to subdue and demoralize their enemies long before the battle begins. The Night Lords' mastery lies in the art of terror, using fear as their primary weapon. Their favorite approach to warfare involves brutal, overwhelming force of a weaker opponent, with no consideration for mercy or subtlety. Theirs is a path of wanton destruction and bloodshed, where they relish in instilling dread and carnage. However, their violent reputation, while mindless now, had once been driven by a sense of purpose. 10 millennia ago, their Primarch, Konrad Curze, known as the Night Haunter, was motivated by an unwavering desire to punish the guilty and impose a brutal sense of absolute justice. He grew up in the lawless environment of Nostramo, a lightless world of industrial decay, where violence and crime reigned supreme. The planet's cities were overrun with an ad hoc version of anarchy, and they produced adamantium, a metal that served as their only valuable export. Curze, being a creature of the dark, survived in the depths of Nostromo's hive cities, fighting for survival amongst the vermin and filth of the sewers. Unlike many of the other Primarchs who were embraced by their homeworlds, Konrad Curze's upbringing was one of isolation and fear. Nostramo was a world devoid of hope or order, and its very nature shaped the dark future of the leader of the Night Lords. His formative years led Curze to resort to acts of savage justice, becoming a spectral figure who preyed upon the wicked and the corrupt. However, his initial pursuit of order was gradually twisted by dark forces who sought to corrupt him. As Curze fell deeper and deeper still into his madness, so too did his vision for the Night Lords. Now his gene sons carry on his legacy, not as enforcers of justice, but as agents of terror. Their lust for murder and the macabre reflects their twisted psyche, which they inherited from their Primarch, who in his final moments acknowledged the futility of his cause. What began as a quest to purge the guilty from the galaxy devolved into an endless cycle of bloodshed, devoid of meaning or any chance for redemption. The story of the Night Lords, the midnight-clad warriors who traded their pursuit for justice for an eternity of terror, is a rather disappointing one. Their tale, much like the galaxy they now haunt, is one of darkness and an eternal war waged in the name of a fallen Primarch who hated them with a burning passion. As many of the Primarchs, Konrad Curze matured rapidly, and the world he would grow up in was nothing short of horrific. The planet of Nostramo was a place steeped in fear, as its corrupt society was dominated by rampant murder and unchecked crime. The streets were shrouded in darkness, with no natural light to break through the gloom. Even the alleys were teeming with dangerous criminals. It was nothing short of an oppressive environment in which Curze would become something more than a mere savior. He would become a predator, targeting the worst of society's offenders. Konrad Curze would embark on a grim crusade of his own. He actively mutilated the remains of those he punished and displayed them publicly, sending a clear message to all those who lived there: fear the Night Haunter. The Night Haunter's reign of terror would soon extend far beyond the criminal underworld, affecting even those common citizens of Nostramo who strove to be good. In time, the fear Curze instilled was so great that all the inhabitants of the city, innocent and guilty alike, locked themselves away. His brutal campaign of vengeance brought about a form of false peace. Said peace was rooted entirely in dread. When the Emperor of Mankind finally found Curze, the Primarch himself had asserted dominance over the planet, ruling as Nostromo's Dark King. However, this was no reign of benevolence. Curze ruled through fear and fear alone, enforcing a grim order where even the smallest infractions were met with a gruesome death. The people believed that the Emperor's arrival marked the beginning of a new era, but when the Emperor took Curze away to Terra, Nostramo plunged back into its natural order, a state of anarchy, as no one remained to uphold the nightmarish peace that Curze had imposed. Curze's methods were unquestionably brutal, and seemed to have stemmed from a deeply rooted belief in absolute justice, albeit a justice twisted by the harsh reality of his upbringing. On Nostramo, Curze learned that only absolute dominance could suppress the chaos around him. Any sign of mercy or weakness would inevitably lead to betrayal. Even after joining his fellow Primarchs in the Emperor's Great Crusade, Curze adhered to these bleak principles. Unlike some of his brothers who fought for hope or unity, Curze saw only the darker truths of his existence, believing that fear and repression were the only effective tools for maintaining order. Curze's demeanor remained somber and introspective all throughout the Great Crusade, as he preferred solitude, avoiding camaraderie from his fellow Primarchs. Instead, he found comfort amongst the warriors of his own legion, the Night Lords. Under his guidance, the Night Lords became masters of fear driven by warfare, employing tactics designed to break the spirits of their enemies long before combat would actually begin. These methods were not merely violent, but they were calculated tactics designed to sow as much terror as possible, ensuring that resistance would seem futile. Even before the galaxy was engulfed in the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords had earned a rather negative reputation for their out-and-out cruelty. The worlds that they brought into compliance did not simply fall to the might of the Imperial forces sent. They were crushed utterly and left with such overwhelming destruction that any thought of rebellion would be extinguished. Where others saw brutality, Curze and his legions saw necessity, believing that crushing opposition in such a thorough and savage manner was the only way to maintain a long-lasting order, the irony of which would not be lost on the legion later. In the end, the legacy of Konrad Curze and the Night Lords became one of fear, control, and merciless conquest, driven once again by Curze's own warped sense of right and wrong. The Night Lords' methods would come to shape the very identity of the Legion, turning them into instruments of terror for millennia to come. As the galaxy burned, they would stand forever apart as dark avatars, a vision of justice that had long since become indistinguishable from madness. Konrad Curze, like many of his rebellious siblings, ultimately crossed the threshold which there was no return from, long before he officially turned against the Emperor. His descent into darkness became increasingly clear following a physical altercation with Rogel Dorn, one of his loyalist brothers, just prior to the Horus Heresy. This act, compounded by Curze's erratic behavior, prompted his fellow Primarchs to convene a council to deliberate on his apparent mental instability. However, Curze preemptively escaped their judgment. On the world of Cherat, he slew his guards and fled from Imperial custody, eventually returning to the one place that had shaped him so profoundly, his homeworld Nostramo. In the year 984 M30, Curze enacted his final and most devastating act of vengeance. Nostramo, once again consumed by the very corruption and lawlessness that he had tried to purge, became a target of his wrath, due to, in essence, proving the core of his principles as faulty. Leading his fleet of Night Lords, Curze ordered a concentrated bombardment on the planet, targeting a weak point in the crust that he had found long ago. This assault unleashed catastrophic devastation and reduced the world to merely space rubble and debris. In that moment, some say Curze not only damned Nostramo, but himself, ensuring his eternal fall from grace. When Horus the War Master would eventually declare his treachery and plunge the galaxy into civil war, Curze rapidly sought to join his ranks, as he embraced the conflict with a fervor that shocked even his allies, indulging in his most malevolent and twisted instincts. For the Night Haunter, it was never simply about defeating the enemy, as Curze taught his legion to make examples out of their adversaries, to obliterate entire cities, slaughter civilians, and leave gruesome displays of broken corpses to serve as warnings to any who might dare oppose them. This campaign of terror and brutality continued unabated, even after Horus's eventual defeat during the Siege of Terra. Interestingly, unlike many of his fellow Primarchs, Curze did not succumb to the temptations of chaos during the Horus Heresy, or even afterwards, while others were elevated to demonhood, receiving the dark blessings of the ruinous powers. Curze remained untouched by such transformations, as his fate was different. Rather than ascend, Curze met his end at the hands of an assassin, dispatched by the Caladius Temple. Many of Curze's decisions were informed by his gift. Throughout his life, Curze had been haunted by the psychic visions of a grim future, which were due to a distorted echo of the precognitive abilities possessed by the Emperor and his brother Sanguinius. These visions had tormented him, constantly showing him the worst possible outcomes for every event, and sometimes showing him gleaming possibilities of hope. However, the overwhelming negativity was what Curze decided to view as reality. It was through one of these visions that Curze foresaw his own death at the hands of an assassin. This prophecy would eventually come to pass when the Caladius assassin Emshen struck him down. In a final grim twist, Curze did not resist his fate, rather he welcomed it, as he believed that allowing Emshen to take his life was the only way he would achieve vindication by proving his fatalist beliefs true. To Curze, his death was a confirmation of his worldview, a world governed by hypocrisy and cruelty. His final act was not one of defiance, but of resignation. In his mind, the Imperium, with all its noble ideas, was built on the same ruthless methods he had been condemned for employing. His death at the hands of the Imperium's agents, therefore, proved the righteousness of his long-held belief that the Emperor's grand vision was no better than his own grim reality. This bitter conclusion, this ultimate validation of his worldview, echoed long after his death, as his gene sons, at least those who had survived the long war, would continue to wage their campaign of terror, bound by their father's legacy. They perpetuated the Night Lord's war of murder and fear, striking from the shadows against the Imperium who they had come to loathe. For them, as for Curze, the war against the corpse emperor would never truly end. It would be a war fought in the darkness, without hope or redemption, just as their Primarch had always believed. Despite his hatred of them, they followed his legacy much more closely than that of the other traitors. The genetic legacy of the Night Lords remains a rather curious anomaly in the history of the Space Marine legions, especially when we consider the path they have taken since their fall from the Emperor's favor. Despite turning traitor during the Horus Heresy, the gene seed of the Night Lords shows an unexpected resilience, maintaining a surprising degree of purity, despite them constantly being in the midst of the corrupting influences of chaos. This stands in stark contrast to many of their fellow traitor legions, whose gene seed has often suffered from significant degradation as it is warped by the influences of chaos. Scholars have long suspected that this unusual ability might be attributed to the Night Lord's lack of direct devotion to any single chaos god. Unlike the followers of Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, the Night Lords do not surrender themselves fully to the ruinous powers, which may have insulated their genetic makeup from the more extreme mutations experienced by other legions. However, while the gene seed of the Night Lords remains at its core stable, the genetic legacy of their Primarch, Konrad Curze, does manifest in certain unique ways. All the members of the Night Lords exhibit certain physical traits, as they possess jet black eyes capable of exceptional night vision and extremely pale skin. The source of these characteristics is hotly debated as to whether they stem directly from the gene seed or from the Nostromian heritage, which was rapidly integrated into the Legion during the days of the Great Crusade, and inversely could have melded into the very artifice of the gene seed itself. What is clear, however, is that these traits heighten the Night Lord's fearsome presence, leading them to an otherworldly appearance, perfectly suited for their preferred methods of warfare, which are rooted in striking terror within their enemies. One of the more curious aspects of Curze's genetic inheritance is the transfer of his precognitive abilities to his gene sons. Though rare, some Night Lords exhibit fleeting glimpses of the future, usually manifesting as subconscious insights or feelings of overwhelming foreboding. These moments are typically dark and unsettling, reflecting the pervasive pessimism and fatalist ideology of Curze's own being. In most cases, these precognitive abilities are rather minor, offering little but heightened paranoia, a trait that has become apparently rather synonymous with the Night Lord's very own identity. Yet in rare cases, the ability is more pronounced, manifesting in full-blown episodes that reveal intricate and detailed visions of the future. These episodes can often last hours, and can be overwhelmingly painful to those afflicted. However, they do offer a rather powerful advantage on the battlefield. Certain warbands of the Night Lords have been able to use these visions to anticipate the movements of their enemies, choosing their next strikes with a precision that suggests they are already aware of what is to come. While such foresight would seem like a gift, Imperial scholars have long theorized that these visions, like those of Curze, often lead the Night Lords into a self-fulfilled prophecy of darker outcomes. It is believed that Curze's own psychic legacy, unlike that of Sanguinius, while being powerful, carries with it an inherent mental instability, a curse, if you will, passed down to his gene sons. This Night Hunter's curse, as it is known, has doomed many of the Legion's most gifted precognitives to a life of torment and tragic fatalism. Most infamous of these prognitive warriors is the Soul Hunter, often referred to as the Prophet amongst his warband. His ability to foresee the future with chilling accuracy made him both feared and revered throughout the Night Lord's ranks, serving as a stark reminder of the burden carried by their once living father. This connection to their gene sire, however twisted, continues to define the Night Lord's culture as a whole, driven by their largely driving their ongoing campaign of terror across the galaxy. In the end, the Night Lords remain a legion, not only bound by their shared descent from Curze, but by his brutal, fatalistic worldview, as regardless if there are other options, they will continue to wage their war of terror, ever driven by the prophetic glimpses of the worst possible future, ensuring that, much like their Primarch, they walk a path which cannot be returned from. During the tumultuous era of the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords would stand apart from their traitor brethren, not due to their devotion to chaos, but due to their disdain for both holy and unholy crusades alike. This legion, once the Emperor's loyal tool of terror, had no grand ideology, no singular belief to unify them, beyond their lust for domination and fear. Unlike the other traitor legions who would mostly pledge themselves to the dark gods, the Night Lords remained largely uninterested in the powers or boons of chaos, choosing instead to embrace bleak independence as their fractured warbands wandered the galaxy, not in the name of some higher cause, but driven by their own hunger for plunder, death, and the near genetic desire to instill terror into their enemies. This rejection of chaos, while not universal amongst them, was rather pervasive. Many Night Lords would shun the company of those who had become fanatics of the ruinous powers, preferring instead to maintain their own nihilistic code. Despite their fragmented nature, the Night Lords' method would remain consistently brutal. Terror was the closest thing to philosophy they believed in. Instilling fear was the ultimate goal of their existence, and it was often achieved before a single blow was struck. To this end, they adorned themselves with symbols of death, crafting their appearance to evoke dread. Their power armor, often heavily modified, would be covered in skulls, skeletons, lightning bolts, grotesque maw-like images, and even the flayed remains of their mortal enemies. For the Night Lords, victory was not simply about fighting their opponents, it was about dominating them psychologically. They used every weapon at their disposal, every tool, every tactic, regardless of how underhanded, to the point that they would even prize many of these more ornate and deadly weapons as trophies for their prowess and their ability to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. Their combat doctrine revolved around achieving psychological, strategic, and tactical supremacy long before they engaged in battle proper, to the point that if they cannot achieve this, they will often retreat. This was a legion that rarely fought fair, as infiltration, stealth, and deception were key elements in their combat style, in many ways resembling that of the Raven Guard. They would position themselves to ambush their enemies, often launching attacks after prolonged campaigns of psychological warfare, wearing down their opponent's will to fight before the final confrontation would take place. To the Night Lords, war was not a matter of honor or glory, but of achieving a swift and decisive victory by any means necessary. They would only engage in combat when assured of an easy victory, never out of bloodlust alone. Since the Horus Heresy, Imperial scholars have sought to understand how the once loyal legions Astartes could fall so deeply into betrayal and wickedness. While the motivations of other traitor legions may be traced to corruption or the lure of power offered by those known as the Chaos Gods, the Night Lords have always been an anomaly, created by the Emperor to bring terror to a lawless galaxy. Some wonder whether they were doomed from the start, or if their brutality was unnecessary evil within the Emperor's vision for a united humanity, or if it was a mistake on his behalf, a reflection of the darkest aspects of their gene sire, Konrad Curze. These questions are without clear answers. Even when the Night Lords were counted amongst the loyalist Space Marine legions, there were always whispers and doubts, as some claimed that they were nothing more than monsters required to drag humanity into the light, while others believed that they were an outright miscalculation by the Emperor, a legion poisoned from the start by their Primarch's twisted worldview and relentless pursuit of fear-based control. Yet others suggested that perhaps they were fated to fall, born for a future that they would help create, but never truly be a part of. Ultimately, all such speculation is moot. Whatever they might have been or could have become, the Night Lords now are little more than creatures of horror, their history stained by atrocities and bloodshed uncountable, as they remain one of the most feared of all the traitor legions, not because of power, but by design. It is not redemption that they seek, nor glory, or even outright power. They exist for terror itself, striving to fulfill the grim legacy of the Primarch. An existence defined by darkness, violence, and a twisted sense of retribution. With the overview completed, let's focus more closely on the Night Lords' history. The 8th Legion, known as the Night Lords, was marked by bloodshed and brutality from their very inception. Born out of the darkest recesses of ancient Terra, their first recruits were not drawn from noble houses or highborn families, but from the condemned, those banished to the lightless prison sinks beneath the planet's surfaces. These vast caverns, filled with the crumbling ruins of millennia past, were the final destination for men and women who had broken the laws of their masters. Here, they were sentenced to live out the rest of their lives, forever severed from the sun and the free air above, existing only in fear and violent struggles for survival. In the lawless depths of the subterranean wastelands, only the most ruthless and cunning could hope to survive. It was a realm where life was cheap and death was always near, with blades deciding the fate of the unfortunate, as they were constantly fed by new arrivals from teeming hive cities above. These prison sinks became breeding grounds for madness, savagery, and unremitted murder. Yet amidst the careless bloodshed and terror, there existed another breed of prisoner. Born into the dark and raised amidst the endless violence, some children grew to adapt to this grim environment. These children, having survived beyond a solar decade, were whispered about in fearful tones by the prisoners themselves, as they moved silently, their skin pale as ash, and even the most hardened killers feared them and sought to avoid these night children at all costs, as they viewed them as creatures shaped by the shadows of their world, figures that would become more than just myth of the prison sinks. It was from these pale and silent beings that the Emperor of Mankind selected the first warriors of the 8th Legion. Unlike their future Astartes brothers in other legions, these warriors carried the mark of their grim origins, as it seemed the ashen skin and somber tones integrated with the gene seed, as they were reflections of the darkness from which they had once come. The gene seed of the 8th Legion was uniquely suited to these Terran-born recruits, enhancing their natural traits in ways that seemed disturbingly deliberate, as though the Emperor himself had crafted their very genetic inheritance with forsaken souls in mind. This gene seed, while granting them heightened abilities typical of Astartes, also amplified their connection to the dark. Their pale skin, already an adaptation for the absence of light, became even more ghostly, and their ability to see in near total darkness surpassed that of any other legion, a gift that even the Space Wolves would be jealous of. This gift, however, was not without a price. Exposure to the light of sun and stars often burned their eyes, forcing them to rely on filters and flare buffers. Even though they now walked the surface above, the warriors of the Night Lords would be forever bound to the shadows, cursed to perceive the light through the lens of eternal night. This legion of misfits, born of the depths of Terra and forged in cruelty, would go on to carve a legacy of fear and terror across the galaxy. Their heritage was unmistakable. Creatures of the dark, molded by the brutal crucible of survival in a world where mercy was unknown. They were the Emperor's chosen instruments, and yet their fate, as many have come to realize, was to walk a dark path, shrouded in death and despair, fitting for those whose very existence began in the darkness. During the Unification Wars, the Emperor of Mankind's 8th Legion was called upon to carry out tasks that few others could stomach. "Send the 8th, the Emperor would reportedly say when hearing of the resurgence of the Crimson Walkers, who were a dire threat to the fledgling Imperium. The 8th Legion, later known as the Night Lords, was deployed where more than just victory was required, when retribution and terror were needed to make an example. Their mission was not only to crush rebellion, but to root out the remnants of the old order, those who clung to the sins of the past and dared defy the new Imperium. Many of these rebellions came from forces that had only submitted to the Emperor out of fear, believing him to be just another temporary warlord amidst the ashes of the techno-barbarian kingdoms that had dominated Old Night. In secret, these groups harbored forbidden practices, refusing to abandon their dark traditions of the past. The Sargon Enclave, for instance, continued to conduct grotesque gene experiments, while the cybreeding programs of the court of Antus openly violated the Emperor's decrees. Perhaps the most notorious was the March of 10 Million, an affront to the emerging Imperium that required a swift and brutal response. It was these situations that the 8th Legion excelled in, showing no mercy and tolerating no ambiguity. Unlike other legions whose moral judgments might allow for nuance, the Night Lords viewed the world in stark, uncompromising terms. Light and dark, innocent and guilty, life and death. There was no room for forgiveness in their vision of justice, only the cold inevitability of retribution. For the 8th, the very concept of morality was indivisible. Once someone was marked as guilty, their fate was sealed. To dwell in the darkness was to forfeit one's right to mercy, and the only language the Night Lord spoke to such beings was the language of violence and bloodshed. In the name of absolute justice, the Night Lords operated with a singular purpose. To them, justice was not kind or merciful, but swift and unyielding, as cold as the steel of the blades they wielded. Their actions were often described as monstrous, but there was an unsettling clarity in their minds. They were a creation born from darkness, yet their war was fought for a future in which their kind might have no place, a future of light, where justice reigned and the shadows had no hold. The question, however, remains, was there nobility in the 8th Legion's actions? Did they truly fight for a better tomorrow? Or were they merely monsters unleashing terror because it was all they knew? Those who reflect on the early days of the Night Lords might find themselves drawn to a more romantic notion that these warriors born of cruelty were necessary evils, doing what others could not for a brighter future. Yet such an interpretation might be too kind. Perhaps, in truth, they were monsters, beings of pure horror, whose atrocities could not be justified by any higher purpose. As history recalls their deeds, one must wonder whether the moral absolution the Night Lords sought was ever real, or merely a justification for unleashing the terror they so relished in. The line between justice and horror, it seems, was as thin as the blades they wielded. The fate of the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, was perhaps sealed long before their Primarch, Konrad Curze, was reunited with them, as it was not merely Curze's arrival that cast a shadow of doom over the Legion, but rather the desolate wastes of Nostramo, the place where Curze was born, and from where his warriors would be derived. Nostramo was more than just the home of their Genestealer, but it was the crucible of corruption, misery, and darkness that fundamentally molded their legion and their descent into the monsters they would become, and their descent into treachery. To understand the true tragedy of the Night Lords, we must first understand Nostramo itself. This bleak, sunless hive world existed in perpetual twilight, its atmosphere thick with the pollution of industry. The planet, as it was, had been orbiting a dying star, one whose feeble light was unable to penetrate the toxic smog that constantly blanketed the surface. Even at high noon, the difference in illumination between day and night was barely perceivable. It was a world that was defined by the shadows, lit only by faint blue illuminating strips which existed in the homes of the wealthy. For the rest of the population, darkness was an omnipresent force, suffocating both physically and mentally, and impacting the morality of all those in the world. Nostromo's wealth came from the vast stems of adamantine ore, which fed the forges of distant worlds. But the riches extracted from its depths did not trickle down to its people. Instead, they were channeled into the hands of the corrupt elite who ruled the world's upmost levels. The planet was in essence divided into 5 massive hive cities, from Nostramo Prime to Nostramo Quintus, each functioning as a self-contained industrial powerhouse. These hive cities were clustered around the planet's narrow habitable zone, where gargantuan constructs of metal and stone with towering smokestacks disappeared into the smog-choked skies. The architecture of the hives themselves mirrored the decay of the world. Narrow alleys twisted between towering structures, crisscrossed by metal bridges. Factories, cathedrals, and the mansions of the elite loomed over the vast slums, their exteriors decorated with grotesque gargoyles that leered at the destitute masses below. Life in the lower levels was brutal and short, as the society of Nostramo was built on exploitation and violence. In these warrens of suffering, the law held no sway, and the only truth was the blade. It was from this world that the 8th Legion's recruits would be drawn from, and it was here that their Genestealer, Konrad Curze, was shaped into the figure that he would become. Nostromo's sky was further darkened by the orbit of its moon, Tenebor, which blocked what little light the dying star could provide. During its rare summers, the moon's orbit synchronized with that of Nostramo, casting the world into an ever deeper darkness, where the distinction between night and day was entirely lost. This environment of perpetual night became more than just a physical reality for the people of Nostramo. It became a psychological and moral one as well. The endless blackness of the sky bred crime, corruption, and despair, and in such conditions, any sense of hope was quickly crushed. The few who thrived did so through brutality and cunning. Those in power held their positions not through value or merit, but through exploitation and fear. The planet's elites resided in their towering spires, insulated from the suffering below, while the rest of the population toiled and fought in the filth and shadows. It was in this crucible of corruption that the man who Konrad Curze would be born. Abandoned and alone, he grew up in the alleyways and undercities of Nostramo, learning from an early age that only violence and terror could keep him alive. The darkness of his homeworld seeped into his very soul, shaping it in a way that would forever change how he saw the universe and his place within it. From Nostramo, Curze would inherit a bleak worldview, one in which justice was cold and unforgiving as the ever-present night which surrounded him. This world, more than any other, set the 8th Legion on its tragic path. For while the Emperor may have designed his sons with a grand purpose in mind, Nostramo had already shaped its chosen son into something darker. The world's legacy passed through Curze to his legion would define the Night Lords forevermore, as creatures of fear, judgment, and blood. As much as Curze's genetic heritage molded the legion, it was the corrupting influence of Nostramo that truly set them on their path to become the terror they would be known for throughout the stars. The Night Lords were born in darkness, and in darkness was where they would remain. Smog hung heavily over Nostramo, a suffocating shroud which turned the faint glow of lamps and windows into sickly pale halos. The air itself was a toxic brew of dust and smoke, along with noxious chemicals which seeped into the very bodies of the planet's inhabitants, hastening their decline into servitude and misery evermore. Life on Nostramo was defined by slow erosion and the loss of hope, where the idea of happiness was a distant, unachievable dream for those who were unfortunately trapped in the hive cities. There was no brightness, only darkness and decay. The physiology of the people of Nostramo remained mostly similar to baseline humans from Segmentum Solar. Yet one haunting detail differed. No resident of Nostramo had irises. Their eyes, entirely pupil, reflected the planet's endless night. Their pale skin was gaunt, and their frames mirrored the harshness of the world. While their personalities were shaped by their environment, one which fostered distrust, callousness, and dark humor, this widespread albinism, though a rare mutation elsewhere, had become commonplace in Nostramo, in an odd way almost mirroring the darkening of the skin of the salamanders. In the endless depths of these cities, most of Nostramo's population lived in abject poverty. They toiled as foundry workers, grinding out a meager existence in the service of the wealthy elites who grew richer and richer still by exploiting the masses and eradicating any opposition. Violence was a constant companion to any of those who lived there. While mental illness and perpetual sorrow were inescapable parts of daily life on Nostramo, overpopulation, which was a frequent bane of hive worlds, was not curbed by law or disease here. Instead, it was self-termination that kept the populace in check, as most citizens would die young, coughing up black dust as their bodies succumbed to long blight or the chemicals that ate away at them from the inside. But these fates, as horrific as they may seem, paled in comparison to the alternatives of death by some of the most sadistic violence imaginable. Nostramo was a planet owned by darkness, body, soul, and spirit. The laws, if they ever truly existed, had long been erased by greed. Murder had become the cruelty of life, and power came only to those willing to kill for it. It was a place where every human sin, great and small, found its home in the eternal night. The remembrancers who documented Nostromo's history after its reclamation by the Imperium recorded that weeping and pleading were the constant sounds carried by the wind. Every child born on this thrice forsaken excuse of a world quickly learned that the only law was the law of the knife, and only the strong had the right to enforce their will. Criminal gangs held sway over every single corner of Nostramo, from the filthy slums to the palaces of the nobility. In the lowest districts, they ruled by sheer terror, torturing and killing as they pleased, waging bloody wars against the feral outcasts who roamed the alleys like wild animals. Many of these gangs were rumored to eat the bodies of the dead, treating their territories as if they were predators. Even within the hive city's mines and factories, the gangs dominated. They functioned, thinly veiled as it might be, as industrial overseers. They bore names that echoed false authority: Iron Overseers, Hands of the Corganado, the Sons of Tile. These slab-muscled enforcers, scarred from years in the furnace, walked the streets, armed to the teeth, stinking of bloodshed as they enforced brutal order over those who were little more than slaves. In the upper levels, where the corrupt aristocracy lived in luxury, their children would form gangs of their own. Raquel's sons and the daughters who strutted about in flamboyant costumes, indulging in the same violent tendencies as the low-born gangs. For them, an insult was easily repaid in blood, as it was in words, and life held no more worth than a few moments of fleeting pleasure. These gangs of nobility, though dressed in the trappings of wealth and power, were no different from the cutthroats in the alleyways below. No matter their station, almost every gang on Nostramo swore fealty to one of the countless barons, counts, or lords who ruled the planet in name only. These powerful figures, many of whom adorned themselves with grand titles that echoed a long-forgotten nobility, were little more than the heads of vast criminal empires. There was no true distinction between the ruling elite and the lower-born gang leaders, as they were cut from the very same corrupt cloth. Together they reigned over a kingdom built upon violence, greed, and unrestrained sin. In the end, Nostramo was a world of horrors. It was a place where the lines between ruler and criminal, light and dark, had long since disappeared, leaving behind only the grim reality of survival in a world devoid of mercy or justice. This was a realm from which Konrad Curze had emerged, and this was the darkness that he carried into the 8th Legion. As much as the Emperor shaped his gene sons, it was Nostramo that left an indelible mark on the Night Lords. The story of Konrad Curze, Primarch of the 8th Legion, is a tale steeped in both horror and tragedy, and one which leads to inevitable doom. His first memories, if we are to believe the heretical chronicles known as the Dark, were of his arrival on Nostramo, the forsaken world that shaped his destiny. According to these accounts, Curze's journey from Terra was no ordinary one. His gestation capsule was violently thrown through the warp by the machination of the Chaos Gods, and, for the 8th time, the universe's worst mother. And his gestation pod was cast, like a fiery comet, into the very shrouded depths of Nostramo. His capsule did not merely land, as it tore through the dense urban sprawl of Nostramo Quintus, the largest hive city on the planet. The force of his arrival was so great that it breached the planet's very crust, burrowing deep into the geosphere, halting only near the molten, unstable core of the planet. The impact would go on to leave a permanent scar on the adamantine-laden crust, a wound that would be feared and whispered about by the planet's inhabitants for generations. Theories abound as to how Curze survived such a catastrophic entry, with some believing that he swam through the molten metal of the planet's mantle, while others claimed volcanic vents may have pushed him back to the surface. Whatever the truth, the manner of his arrival was as violent and unyielding as the life he would lead. Unlike many of his fellow Primarchs, who were discovered and raised by adoptive families, Curze found himself utterly alone in the depths of Nostramo's underhive. The world he was born into was one of relentless darkness and despair, and so too was the life he was forced to lead. In the feral depths of the lower levels of Nostramo Quintus, Curze survived through sheer willpower, hunting the mutated animals that prowled the hive's twisted alleys. His survival was not just a testament to his physical prowess, but also the terrifyingly sharp instincts he developed in the hostile environment. Yet even from his earliest days, Curze was haunted. Unlike his brothers, who were driven by grand ideals or heroic visions, Curze was tormented by precognitive nightmares, visions of dark, inevitable futures. These waking dreams were not fleeting or vague. They were vivid and horrific, impossible to escape even. They filled his fledgling mind with images of blood, death, and betrayal, portents of paths he would one day walk. These visions cursed him, shaping his worldview and driving him towards a grim philosophy of macabre fatalism that defined his rule and his legion. For Curze, the future was not a dream of possibility or hope. It could not be changed. It was a paranoid nightmare from which there was no escape. As Curze grew, so did his infamy. He would become a figure of dread, a specter, haunting the already darkened corridors of Nostramo. The underworld he had been born into was one ruled by violence and fear, and Curze was a master of both. His vision of justice was one absolute, shaped by prophetic nightmares and the brutal world around him. He did not seek admiration, only fear, the purest, most primal response. To him, fear was a truth, a force that stripped away any pretense and revealed the dark souls of humanity. In his eyes, the darkness of Nostramo was not just physical, it was spiritual, and it reflected the rot at the heart of humanity's very soul. Curze embodied and embraced this darkness, and in doing so, he became its ruler. Uniquely amongst the Primarchs, Konrad Curze grew up utterly alone and untouched by the guiding hand of any human parent or mentor. Abandoned in the underhives of Nostramo Quintus, in essence, his wit and unyielding resolve would be all that kept him alive. His environment, a world of ceaseless darkness, suffering and corruption became a crucible. Curze's genetically enhanced body and mind, designed by the God Emperor, gave him an unparalleled amount of strength, speed, and cunning, which he used to establish dominance in the lawless hive cities of Nostramo. Through sheer force of terror, Curze imposed a brutal sense of order on the violent and corrupt society around him. The criminal gangs and the corrupt nobles that had once ruled with impunity became the targets of his horrific justice. He became a dark arbiter of retribution, and in doing so, he began to shape Nostroman society in his own image, but he never attempted to change them in any long-lasting way. What started in the decaying streets of Nostramo Quintus soon spread to the planet's other hive cities. This once ungovernable hive world trembled under the shadow of Curze's reign. Within a single standard year of his rise, the crime rate across Nostramo plummeted to near zero. The population, accustomed to the chaotic lawlessness that had reigned for generations, now lived in paralyzing fear. Entire cities became still as Curze's reign of terror expanded. The streets of Nostramo Quintus, once teeming with life, even in the dead of night, became deserted husks after dark. No one dared walk the streets after sunset, for what little that light was worth. A self-imposed curfew took root upon the planet. Shops closed early, and the once bustling alleyways fell into an eerie silence. It wasn't long before Curze's reign of terror earned him a new moniker, that of the Night Haunter, a title that spread like wildfire. Whispered in hushed voices by the terrorized citizens, mothers began to discipline their children with threats of the Night Haunter, a faceless specter that would roam the streets, seeking out the wicked to punish in the most grotesque ways imaginable. The image of a dark figure with filthy claws, always ready to disembowel those who defied his law, became etched into the very psyche of the people. As rumors of his atrocities grew, so did Curze's legend. The very mention of the Night Haunter's name could send ripples of fear through Nostroman hive cities, as his reign was not one of admiration and respect, but one of pure, unrelenting dread. The terror that he invoked was physically palpable, casting shadows over the entire planet, as the populace of Nostramo would now live in a constant state of fear, silence, and compliance, knowing that even a whisper of dissent could bring down the Night Haunter's wrath upon them. With the populace cowed, Curze's iron grip upon the hive cities tightened. What was once chaotic and lawless was now bent to his will. But the cost of this pervasive atmosphere of terror? It seems Nostramo had not been saved, but rather it had been enslaved by fear, made ripe for the rule of the Night Haunter. Curze's dark justice reigned supreme. Through an unrelenting campaign of brutality, Curze eventually ascended to become the undisputed ruler of both his home hive city, Nostramo Quintus, and soon after the entire planet of Nostramo. During this reign, he earned the Night Haunter title, synonymous primarily with the brutal murder of hundreds, if not thousands, of Nostromo's criminals and corrupt aristocrats. Later, in the era of the Horus Heresy, Curze would quickly reclaim this title, as he descended into the service of chaos. As the self-declared Dark King of Nostramo, Curze embraced his new role with an insatiable thirst for knowledge, absorbing all available information with a diligence bordering on obsession which could outpace Magnus's own. He ruled with a paradoxical mix of temperance and savagery. His leadership, when uninterrupted by injustice, was marked by reason and moderation. Yet when tales of corruption or wrongdoing would reach his ears, his response was rather swift and terrifying. Curze would personally hunt down the guilty through the hive city's labyrinthian streets, driving them to exhaustion before delivering the final gruesome punishment, mutilation, but never beyond recognition. It was a fate known to every citizen and to all those who knew the individual hunted down, one that fostered a deep-seated dread across the planet. This chilling blend of calculated wisdom and unspeakable violence shocked Nostroman society into submission rather than any real change. Under the watchful eye of the Night Haunter, the populace shifted towards a strange, fearful equilibrium. For the first time, honesty and efficiency became the cornerstones of their lives. Crime dwindled to nothing, while the planet's exports of adamantium a resource which was valued by every neighboring world, would drastically skyrocket. The transformation was rather remarkable. Once shrouded in darkness and corruption, Nostramo's Quintus became a city of light and prosperity, driven by shared wealth and terror. The rest of Nostramo would soon follow the example set by its capital. The Night Hunter's influence would spread like a shadow across the entire planet, and every last one of its hive cities adopted his harsh and effective order. Fear of attracting Curze's attention kept the people in line, ensuring that the horrors that befell those in Quintus never reached their own homes. Curze's reign effectively eradicated Nostramo's long-standing culture of crime and predation for now, as he dismantled the planet's criminal syndicates and eliminated the corrupt hierarchy that had ruled for centuries, replacing them with his own brand of draconian justice. The people revered him, not as a tyrant, but as an effective leader and a monster who had restored order where none had existed before. Curze's tactics and his instinctual use of stealth, his ability to strike without warning, and his unparalleled mastery of psychological warfare were characteristics that would later define the 8th Legion of Space Marines, who would become known as the Night Lords. Even before the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords had already begun decorating their armor with macabre symbols of death, understanding as their Primarch did that fear could be wielded as a weapon, as potent as any bolter or chainsword. Thus, under Curze's reign, Nostramo would be reshaped and molded by fear, ruled by a man whose justice was as cold and dark as the eternal night that enshrouded his home. Nearly a century after the Great Crusade had begun, the Emperor of Mankind finally set his sights on Nostramo. The year was 896 M30, and Nostromo's fate, long prophesied, was sealed by the Emperor's arrival. According to ancient Nostroman legends, the coming of this radiant figure would herald the planet's ultimate downfall. The Emperor descended upon Nostramo, and said descent was unlike anything its people had ever seen. His presence brought the sunlight into their eternally darkened world for the first time in memory. As his fleet touched down, the Emperor himself, accompanied by an Imperial delegation, walked in the rain-slicked streets of Nostramo Quintus, the capital city. The citizenry, accustomed to living under the cloak of perpetual night, recoiled at the brilliance of his light. It is said that the radiance he emanated reflected so powerfully from the wet streets that those who dared gaze upon it were blinded. Most could only weep, unable to bear the sheer intensity of his presence. At the heart of the city stood the royal palace of the Night Hunter. It was there, at the end of the avenue, that Curze awaited the Emperor's approach. As the delegation neared, Curze was suddenly overwhelmed by a psychic vision, an inescapable glimpse of the terrifying future. The vision so vividly horrifying that the Night Hunter, in an attempt to rid himself of these images, tried to tear his own eyes out. However, before he could succeed, the Emperor intervened. At that moment, their fates intertwined, as the Emperor, with a voice as commanding as it was calm, addressed Curze directly. "Be at peace, Konrad Curze. I have arrived and I intend to take you home." Curze's response was a chilling testament to the weight of the destiny that he had long borne. "That is not my name, father. My people gave me a name, and I will bear it until my dying day, and I know full well what you intend for me." Curze's words revealed the depth of his foresight and his intimate knowledge for the path that lay before him. He submitted to the Emperor's will, not out of newfound loyalty, but as if resigning to an inevitable role in a tragedy he had long foreseen. In that instant, the fate of Curze and the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, was sealed. The path before them was dark, leading inevitably towards corruption and damnation. This pivotal moment, the meeting between the Emperor and the Night Hunter, set Nostramo on a course from which there was no return. The Emperor's light, though blinding in its brilliance, could not reach the darkest corners of Curze's soul, and the vision of the future that had haunted Curze since his youth would soon manifest, shaping not only the destiny of his legion, but casting a long shadow over the Imperium's future. Thus, the fall of Nostramo and the tragedy of Konrad Curze began to unfold in earnest, a dark chapter in the history of the Great Crusade that would reverberate throughout the ages. During the Great Crusade, the Night Lords rose to prominence under the command of their Primarch Konrad Curze, now widely recognized as the Night Haunter. His methods were forged in the darkness of Nostramo and showed themselves to be rather ruthless and unwavering in their dedication to terror tactics. Unlike other legions, the Night Lords held no interest in glory or honor. Instead, they sought out only to impose Imperial compliance through sheer and unadulterated terror. Curze's approach to warfare was stark and merciless, a mindset captured in one of their most chilling multi-channel Vox broadcasts during the pacification of Lystrania 4.
We have received your offer of surrender and reject it. We did not come to receive your supplication, but to enact judgment. The time for surrender has long passed. The verdict is writ by your own hands. Now is a time to die.
In the early days of the Great Crusade, Curze studied the doctrines of the Legions Astartes under the mentorship of Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Though he absorbed the Imperium's strategies rather quickly, he began to shape his legion into a unique, brutal image, one who did not stick to these combat doctrines and strategies. The Night Haunter molded the Night Lords into a force devoid of mercy and restraint, whose methods were as dark as the nightmares he had long endured. Under his command, the Night Lords became synonymous with fear, their power armor adorned with grim, macabre imagery, designed to terrify their enemies before the battle had even begun. Skulls, death masks, and symbols of doom became the standard, amplifying their already rather skilled psychological warfare tactics which Curze had wielded for so long. This proved to be remarkably effective, and in many cases, the mere rumor of the Night Lord's approach was enough to compel a star system to pay overdue Imperial tithes and rebellions or purge the ranks of traitors and mutants, if only to avoid their inevitable wrath. Despite their early successes, it soon became clear that the Night Lord's methods were not only brutal but excessive. Their reliance on terror and punishments began to spiral into unchecked and unabashed cruelty, in a reflection of their Primarch's dark outlook on life, which was increasingly becoming more and more morbid, which in turn would push them further and further still. What began as a deliberate strategy to enforce orders swiftly descended into an obsession with fear and domination. The Legion's extreme methods would soon earn them a fearsome reputation, but it also would isolate them from their fellow legionaries. As Curze and the Night Lords advanced in the Crusades, their homeworld Nostramo, left without its dark ruler, would revert to its original lawless ways. The enforced peace Curze had so brutally hefted onto the planet began to crumble, and it would once again become a breeding ground for crime, corruption, and all manner of degeneracy. The decay did more than just undermine Curze's earliest achievements. It tainted the very source of the 8th Legion's recruits. Nostramo now would become a world steeped in lawlessness, as it began to supply not the best and brightest, but the most violent and cruel, bloodthirsty members of its population. The new recruits were in essence a reflection of the growing darkness within the Legion itself. Some argue that this influx of violent recruits was a turning point for the Night Lords, poisoning their ranks and driving them further into madness and cruelty. But this theory fails to acknowledge the deeper influence of Curze's leadership. Though he grew to despise many of his Genesons, seeing them as a reflection of his own internal torment, he would remain their undisputed master. His hatred for what his legion had become did not diminish his control, nor the effectiveness of the terrifying methods they employed. The reunification of the Night Lords with their Primarch, while initially promising, set the Night Lords into an irreversible path towards nihilism and into becoming some of the most vile traitors humanity has ever seen. Their fall from grace, which begun in the shadow of Nostromo's crime-ridden streets, would soon escalate into full-blown rebellion. As the Great Crusade would continue, the Night Lords would become increasingly feared. But now it was not just by their enemies, but by the Imperium itself. As the Great Crusade would continue to progress, the Night Lords would become known as much for their atrocities as for their victories. battle brothers of the Kondrav tactical squads, like so many of their kin, charged with heraldry into combat, bringing not just conquest, but terror to every world they touched. Far from curbing their savagery, Konrad Curze's interactions with his legion seemed to push them further and further still, delivering what he called a peace through atrocity to planet after planet. In some cases, such brutality appeared justified or even necessary to break the will of rebellions. However, often there was no clear reason for the excess carnage. Entire populations were annihilated, cities skinned and crucified alive, not out of necessity, but because the Night Lords seemed to now revel in it. They were no longer monsters by design, but rather monsters by choice. This transformation of the Night Lords from enforcers of Imperial law to agents of indiscriminate terror reflected Curze's own growing mental instability. His control over his legion and their innate violent behavior began to erode as the horrific visions that plagued him since his youth increased both in clarity and frequency. He would even foresee his own downfall, and with it, the collapse of the Imperium's hopes for his legion. Yet despite the Emperor's clear concerns about Curze's mental state and the escalating atrocities committed by the 8th Legion, no decisive action would be taken to rein in their savagery, as was done with other legions. There were words, demands, and potentially even threats, but nothing substantial enough to halt the spiral into darkness that had overtaken the Night Lords. Eventually, their reputation would be a more powerful tool than the weapons they wielded themselves. When rogue planetary governors or rebellious systems learned that the Night Lords were en route, many hastened to restore order or pay overdue tithes, and even eradicate perceived disloyalty. Fear of the Night Lords was indeed justified, as the Night Lords issued exterminatus on entire worlds for even a minor offense, or for a single agent who had gone against Imperial compliance. However, the unchecked reign of terror would come at a cost. Over the solar decades, the chain of atrocities committed in the Emperor's name grew ever longer, and winding like a tightening noose around the necks of the Night Lords. The crimes of the Night Lords began to weigh heavily not just on the Imperium, but on Curze himself, as his visions of the inevitable dark future, where his legion would be damned, and his own fate sealed, would cause a feedback loop which would draw him further into madness and would lead into more atrocities. However, the question remains, why did the Emperor allow this to continue? Why did he not intervene more forcefully, like he had done with other Primarchs? It seems history would not leave us with a clear answer. Was Curze's usefulness as a weapon of fear far too valuable to relinquish, even as his soul was inevitably darkened? Or was the Emperor's inaction a form of tactful consent? A belief that the ends did in fact justify the means, that no matter how horrifying the means became, for whatever reason the Night Lords would be allowed to continue their bloody path. By the time Curze finally turned against the Emperor, the chain of atrocities had spiraled into an abyss from which there was no return. Of all the legions, none were more outright feared, none more shrouded in suspicion and darkness than the Night Lords themselves, as no one was surprised of their betrayal, as they were increasingly drawing closer to multiple censures for their crimes. While the massacres they carried out might have been under the banner of the Imperium, they were permitted to continue, but now that they were no longer a part of it, it seems their luck ran out. It is easy to see that the Night Lords had always been destined to fall and become creatures of darkness, whether it was due to being bound by a will of a father who, in his righteousness and foreboding, could never truly control them, or due to their own dark desires. In the end, what else could have been their fate but to return to the night from whence they came? And so, the 8th Legion, once the undisputed enforcers of Imperial justice, became architects of chaos, led by Primarch who had long foreseen the doom of them all. During the early years of the Great Crusade, the Imperium had expanded far beyond the Sol system, and it would encounter pockets of resistance amongst its newly conquered territories. Many of these rebellions were swiftly crushed, often without public notice. However, some insurgencies did require more than mere suppression. They demanded retribution. One such incident was the castigation of Vinhari, a tale that would go down in history as both a lesson in terror and a warning for those who defied the Imperium and what would be the price of said defiance. This world was a natural fortress, a city enclave built into the walls of immense chasms that had once belonged to the infamous Pan-Pacific Empire, ruled by the tyrant Narthan Doom during the Age of Strife. This region had been one of the last of Doom's strongholds to fall during the Emperor's brutal wars of unification. Yet, under the yoke of Imperial rule, the people of Benhari seemed to remain sullen, quietly resentful of their conquerors. However, that silence would soon be broken by the arrival of the Crimson Walkers, a cabal of psychers and gene splicers, along with warlords who had once served the ancient Terran tyrants. These shadowy figures slowly gathered their strength, spreading their influence like a creeping plague across Terra. At the heart of their conspiracy lay Benhari, a city now determined to return to the chaos and brutality of the Age of Strife. When the Emperor became aware of the Crimson Walkers, he initially responded in a rather swift and chilling method. All he spoke were 3 simple words: send the 8th. The 8th Legion, now known as the Night Lords, were not present in great numbers within the Sol system at the time. There were little more than 500 Astartes at their disposal. They could never hope to overwhelm the facility, which was fortified not just by millions ready to die for their beliefs, but by the sheer fortifications that had been taken over. But as history would show, the Night Lords would not need to rely on numbers. Their weapons of choice were fear and fear itself. The campaign of Terra began with an orbital bombardment that fell upon their stronghold from the night sky. For 6 relentless hours, the city was pounded by explosive fire from far above, shattering fortifications and plunging the populace into chaos. But it was what followed that truly marked the coming of the Night Lords. After the bombardment ceased, the city remained cloaked in artificial darkness, a perpetual twilight that seeped into the very hearts of those below. Soon, a chemical-laden downpour rained from the heavens, further poisoning the air and filling the minds of the city's inhabitants with unremitting terror. From the blackened sky, the 8th Legion descended. Jets of flame erupted as they landed amidst the chaos, their forms emerging from the abyss like shadows of death, clad in fearsome power armor that was adorned with every conceivable symbol of terror. The Night Lords would then sweep through the city, killing indiscriminately. Any who dared cross their paths would be butchered in the most painful and methodical ways imaginable, their screams of horror filling the poisoned air. The Crimson Walkers, desperate to defend their stronghold, unleashed an army of mutant monstrosities, creations of gene splicing and dark experimentation. But even these abominations could not hold back the relentless tides of the 8th. Armed with lightning-sheathed claws and the skills of masters of war, the Night Lords cut through these mutants as though they were nothing but mere prey. The battle was not a contest of strength or strategy, it was merely a display of unrelenting horror, designed to send a message. The castigation of Benhari was more than just a military operation, but it was an act of psychological warfare, a punishment intended to instill fear not only into the hearts of the rebellious, but anyone who might even consider defying the Emperor's will. By the time the 8th Legion had completed this grim task, the city was broken beyond repair, and its populace crushed not under the weight of the Night Lords' overwhelming power, but in the terror they had sowed. And as the Night Lords vanished as suddenly as they had arrived, they left behind a city which would never know rebellion again. They had indeed carried out the Emperor's judgment. The 8th had delivered a message, and that message was that defiance would not be met with mercy, but with the full and terrifying weight of the Imperium's darkest warriors. In another chilling episode, the Night Lords unleashed a virus bomb upon an entire continent. The rationale of this extreme measure was the emergence of a cult, which we now know was being devoted to the pleasure god, Slaanesh, on a remote island within the continent itself. The repercussions of this act was rather devastating and immediate. As the bomb ravaged the land and its inhabitants, nothing was left except a toxic wasteland. These incidents would become emblematic of not only the Night Lords' brutal tactics, but of what drew such widespread condemnation from other Space Marine legions. Critics would cite the fact that the temple was not the only thing targeted for utter destruction, and the indiscriminate devastation of the continent as unequivocal evidence that the Night Lords had a rather dangerous propensity for excessive force. However, there were also incidents such as their interactions with the dangerous Xenos menace, known to the higher echelons of the Imperium as the Archheth, or colloquially the Bone Drinkers. These insidious life forms were characterized by their fungoid, predatory, and parasitic nature, as they thrived as sentient entities operating in physically interwoven clusters referred to as blooms. Their grotesque existence was sustained through the organizing and siphoning of vital nutrients from other species, primarily derived from the bone marrow of living creatures, with a seeming particular focus on humans. Devoid of any technological ingenuity, the Bone Drinkers seemed to inhabit the derelict void ships of other species, resorting to predation against isolated colonies of feral worlds, which lacked the means to defend themselves. The Night Lords, not yet officially named but already infamous in their ruthlessness, had originally confronted this alien threat in the early years of the Great Crusade alongside the Luna Wolves, wherein they would execute extermination campaigns believed to have successfully eradicated the Bone Drinkers. However, the cowardice inherent in these Xenos allowed them to evade total destruction, returning to the shadows when cornered. By the year 986 M30, troubling reports began to surface regarding renewed attacks on isolated outposts and shipping lanes within the stellar wastes near Olmec. Evidence would suggest that the remains of the Bone Drinkers had not only survived, but were also growing in numbers and strength at a geometric rate, posing a renewed threat to Imperial interests. The Alpha Legion, recently reunited with their Primarch, was charged with the critical task of eradicating this alien menace before it could proliferate further. However, it seems that they had significantly more difficulties than Curze and Horus's own legions did. Over a harrowing 3-year campaign, the Alpha Legion would engage in a systematic campaign against the Bone Drinkers, employing tactics designed to outmaneuver and annihilate the Bone Drinkers. By the campaign's conclusion, the once feared Xenos were all but extinguished, their existence reduced to merely a dark chapter in the ongoing saga of the Imperium. Another incident which would show why Konrad Curze would be so ready to announce his devotion and siding with Horus Lupercal, the infamous arch-traitor of the Horus Heresy, would be because the Night Lords alongside the Luna Wolves would play a pivotal role, working together and bringing in the world of Daromir into Imperial compliance. The mission, while seemingly straightforward, would show everyone the violent lengths the Imperium would go to in order to secure allegiance from reluctant worlds. Here, as the Night Lords advanced, they would employ terror tactics and would show a brutal efficiency while working with the Luna Wolves. One of the most notorious episodes in their history, in particular during these campaigns, would be against the Shihugal Dominion. This operation was marked by an overwhelming ferocity and the remorseless employment of tactics such as throwing the skinned corpses off of captured enemies into the public, and the eventual complete annihilation of the Shihugal civilization. The sheer scale of destruction on this incident would become a legend throughout the Great Crusade. During the earlier stints of the Great Crusade, the Imperium would enter the Ordani cluster only to be confronted by a rather formidable enemy, the warlord Valtel Garon Terratus. Faced with the overwhelming might of the Imperium, Terratus recognized the futility of his own resistance, choosing the path of survival and surrendering to the Imperium. This pivotal decision would mark a rather complex relationship with the Imperium that would span over 5 decades. During this time, Tenturus rose to further prominence, conquering numerous worlds in the name of the Emperor, cultivating a reputation that had garnered the attention of several influential figures such as Malcador the Sigillite and various Primarchs. However, the tides would soon turn when Tenturus ultimately would turn against the Imperium for his own gain. This act would cause shockwaves to reverberate through the ranks of the Imperium as a whole, as he launched a counter-crusade, seeking to reclaim worlds that were already compliant. in order to expand his own burgeoning empire. In response to this, the Imperium would mobilize their forces, sending in Horus and his Luna Wolves in order to confront this renegade warlord. The mission was twofold: dismantle his insurrection and deliver a stark warning to any within the Imperium who might look at the man as an example of what they should attempt. Joining the Luna Wolves once more were the Night Lords, but this time the Iron Hands and the Alpha Legion would also have their own contingents joining in their campaign. A rather formidable coalition of forces would be formed, hell-bent on retribution. At the zenith of this campaign, Horus himself, accompanied by a cadre of 50 elite Justarian Terminators, executed a daring teleportation aboard the bridge of Tentras's own flagship. In a swift and brutal confrontation, Horus personally dispatched the unrepentant traitor with his talon, delivering a definitive blow to the rebellion. Following his death, the rebellion would soon fall into disarray, haunted by the terrifying tales of the Imperium's might and the culling of the warlords that had accompanied this traitor's campaigns. The Night Lords in particular seemed to take ruthless delight in their pursuit, systematically decimating every single world within Terrantis' realm. The Iron Hands, alongside elements of the Ordo Reductor, unleashed devastating firepower upon Bastion worlds. Cities that once stood proud were reduced to mere ash and dust, and the very air of the man's homeworld became permanently laden with toxins, as a testament to the thoroughness the Imperium would go through in any response against rebellion. When the castigation of Tentris was finally complete, Horus dispatched the gold-dipped skull of the fallen warlord to Terra, accompanied by a grim warning which was articulated by the messenger: "So perish all traitors." This chilling declaration would become all too ironic in later years. The Night Lords would wind up playing pivotal roles in multiple compliance campaigns. In particular, one of these would be known as Karhagatan, designated 154-6. This joint operation saw the Night Lords allied with the formidable Primarch Vulcan and his Salamander's Legion, alongside the forces of the Mechanicum and the Legio Ignis Titan Legion, along with various regiments of Imperial army. As the campaign unfolded, tensions would simmer between the two legions, culminating in a confrontation that would leave lasting scars on their brotherhood. During this campaign, the Night Lords adopted a strategy rooted in committing acts of brutality around civilian population centers. In one particularly notorious incident, they systematically slaughtered the inhabitants of an entire city and left their corpses visible, ensuring the compliance of neighboring cities through sheer terror. This singular act drew the ire of Vulcan like no other, as he was deeply disturbed by his brother Konrad Curze's ruthless approach to warfare. When Vulcan confronted Curze regarding the actions of his sons, their exchange would escalate into a brief yet intense skirmish between the two Primarchs. This clash would become emblematic of the growing rift between them, highlighting the stark contrast between the philosophies surrounding warfare and the treatment of civilians. Vulcan, being a champion of honor and protection, found Curze's methods abhorrent, igniting a fire of animosity that would continue to burn long after the campaign's conclusion. Following the successful subjugation, Vulcan took it upon himself to report Curze's conduct to the War Master Horus and to his brother Primarch Rogel Dorn, the master of the Imperial Fists Legion. The events on this particular compliance campaign would have far-reaching consequences and profoundly impact Vulcan's fate during and after the catastrophic dropsite massacre on Isfahan V. The events of 972 M30 and 984 M30 would stand as pivotal moments of conflict and foreboding, in particular dealing with the interplay of ambition, power, and tragedy amongst the Primarchs. The Pharynstius extermination remains one rather shrouded in obscurity and conspiracy, in particular parts of it being outright erased from Imperial archives. However, what is known is that a joint operation for Imperial compliance was undertaken between the Night Lords and the Raven Guard. However, other than that, raised questions about the scale of violence and the tactics employed, along with the ultimate fate of all those involved. In contrast, the pacification of the Sherrod system in 984 M30 was rather well recorded, and it showed a chilling escalation of tensions between the Primarchs, along with their legions during this tumultuous era. This campaign saw the Night Lords collaborating with the Emperor's Children and the Imperial Fists in a concerted effort to bring the system into Imperial compliance. However, the operation quickly spiraled into chaos. Due to the unstable emotional state overcome by his violent fits, Fulgrim rushed to the aid of Konrad Curze, who had confided in him of his disturbing visions. Curze foretold his own demise at the hands of the Emperor, and it seems that this deeply impacted Fulgrim, along with the knowledge of the impending deaths of many of the Primarchs in conflict with one another, and the catastrophic fate of his own homeworld of Nostramo, which at this point he believed would be irrevocably destroyed by the Emperor's very light. These ominous revelations troubled Fulgrim rather deeply, prompting him to share them with Rogel Dorn. However, Dorn's reaction was one of outrage, viewing Curze's implications as a grave affront upon the Emperor's honor. The confrontation escalated into violence, culminating in Dorn being found unconscious and grievously injured. A large chunk of flesh had even been torn from his torso. At that moment, Curze loomed over his fallen brother, his pallid form weeping, a haunting image of self-loathing and remorse. The gravity of this action led to his immediate detention and exile to his chambers, while the remaining Primarchs convened. However, the tensions would not dissipate, as hours later, the Council of Primarchs would disband, only to discover that Curze had seemingly vanished, and the honor guard of the Imperial Fists, which had been posted at his door, lay butchered. By the time they had initiated pursuit, the Night Haunter had already slipped away with his legion into the warp, leaving behind a trail of dread and uncertainty. And so the Night Haunter had abandoned the Imperium. The year was 984 M30, and it marked a rather climactic turn in events. This was the destruction of Nostramo, the homeworld of the Night Lord's Legion. This devastating exterminatus action was executed under the very legion that once drew its strength from the planet. Following a series of tragic and violent incidents unfolding during the Great Crusade, including Curze's assault on his brothers, the Night Haunter, who had attacked Rogel Dorn, was now officially seen as a rogue element. In a grim display of both power and despair, the 8th Legion unleashed deadly land strikes upon Nostramo, targeting the planet's unstable core. The precision of these attacks triggered catastrophic seismic activity, which culminated in a wave of destruction that ultimately shattered the planet apart. This horrific act fulfilled Curze's haunting visions of his homeworld's annihilation. As he had foreseen, beams of white light raining down from the heavens to obliterate the planet. In the aftermath of the self-inflicted cataclysm, the Emperor would directly summon Curze to Terra in order to confront him regarding his brutal tactics and his actions. However, the Night Haunter, instead of facing retribution, allied himself with the War Master Horus, embracing open rebellion against the Imperium during the Horus Heresy, before he could stand before his father. The catastrophic end of Nostramo not only represented physical destruction of a world, but it also signaled the final relinquishment of honor the Night Lords would ever hold. While many Imperial historians have long heralded the Dropsite Massacre as the first open conflict between the Emperor's Primarchs, it is critical to recognize that there exists a prior incident, that of the grievous attack on Dorn by Curze. This act of violence and the destruction of an Imperial-held world predates the conflicts within the Isvan system and the scouring of Prospero. The mental instability of the Night Haunter, an aspect which the Imperium had rather overwhelmingly overlooked, sat at the heart of the first volley of rebellion from a Primarch. In the climactic aftermath of the destruction of Nostramo, there seems to be divergent accounts of Konrad Curze's subsequent actions, seemingly revealing a rather complex interplay between defiance and disillusionment. One prominent narrative suggests that Konrad and the Night Lord's Legion were summoned back to Terra itself, compelled to justify their actions to the Emperor directly and the esteemed Council of Terra. This confrontation, if true, would prove critical to the Emperor's discontent. When supposedly brought before the Emperor, Curze articulated a defense rooted in his deep-seated conviction that Nostramo, in the Legion's absence, had regressed into a state of violence and criminality, and that he and his Legion felt profoundly embittered by what had been perceived as the Emperor's hypocrisy. Despite the Council's condemnation of their brutality, they saw a stark contradiction in the Emperor's grand vision: a Great Crusade predicated on the use of military might to forcibly reunite humanity, often against the very wishes of the humans who were being reclaimed. The Night Lords expected an acknowledgement from the Emperor for their actions, believing that their severe measures were a distinct reflection of the mission the Imperium had always assigned them, one that could be characterized as sanctioned terror against any opposition to the Imperium's expansionist agenda. To Curze, the Emperor's very rebukes felt like a betrayal, a condemnation for executing the very strategies that it deemed essential to the Imperium's establishment. Curze's growing resentment would then transform into a belief that the Emperor was unwilling to confront the harsh realities necessitated by his vision of complete human reunification. This sentiment not only deepened the rift between Curze and the Emperor, at least if it truly occurred, but also signaled a pivotal moment within the Night Lord's trajectory into the embrace of Horus's waiting arms. In stark contrast to the previous narratives, an alternative account had emerged regarding Konrad Curze and the Night Lord's Legion following the climactic destruction of Nostramo. Rather than going back to Terra to face judgment, Curze and his forces allegedly vanished into the uncharted regions of the ongoing Great Crusade. This account suggests that news of the silent rebellion led by one of the Emperor's Primarchs never permeated into the wider Imperium. Consequently, no formal writs of condemnation or denunciations would be issued by the Emperor, the Imperial Court, or the Council of Terra, nor punitive fleets dispatched to confront the errant Primarch. Elements of the Night Lords stationed within various expeditionary fleets encountered no repercussions, which lends some weight to this belief, while the Night Hunter himself retreated into the shadows beyond the bounds of known Imperial space, continuing his campaigns of conquest and bloodshed in the Emperor's name. It seems that the leaders of the Imperium, at least in this retelling, valued the overarching unity of the Emperor's crusade across the stars more than the public punishment of a wayward warlord, perhaps even fearing the potential repercussions of provoking a Primarch further still. In lieu of direct confrontation, the Imperium resorted to more subtle measures of punishment. They halted shipments of vital supplies to sectors controlled by the Night Lords, effectively banishing Curze from the very vanguard of the Great Crusade. This strategic isolation aimed to curtail the influence and power of the Night Lords without inciting open conflict with the volatile Primarch. By the early years of the 31st millennium, the Court of Terra deemed this strategy effective and would issue a formal order for the Night Hunter's recall. With this, Curze was granted a position within the Loyalist fleets, which were being assembled to counter the sudden betrayal of Horus Heresy at Isfahan. This pivot marked a significant turn in the Great Crusades. Hatred is never so sweet and vengeance never so pleasurable than when it is applied to one once loved. This was a Nostroman proverb which had permeated the Legion's beliefs. In the records of Konrad Curze's emergence as a quintessential embodiment of malevolence, his reputation for brutality and sadistic tendencies was rather well established amongst his brothers, long before the onset of the Horus Heresy proper, compounding his infamy with the horrific actions which led to the annihilation of his own homeworld, Nostramo, as well as his violent confrontation with his brother Rogaldorn. Like several Primarchs, Curze had inherited a fragment of the Emperor's psychic abilities, in particular his precognitive abilities, a rather flawed shard of his vast vision. Whereas the Emperor and Sanguinius could perceive a multitude of potential features and navigate through their consequences and complexities, Curze was seemingly confined to a singular, seemingly linear, harrowing vision, a bleak trajectory riddled with failure and death. This oppressive foresight seemed to have poisoned his mind and led him right into the arms of Horus Heresy, as the stage was now set for the Horus Heresy. In the chaos of Isstvan V, while the sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, along with the Emperor's children, appeared to falter, an unexpected event would occur. The traitor forces would quickly regain their momentum, mounting a rather effective counteroffensive that would seal the fate of many loyalists. As Horus pressed his attack, he orchestrated a tactical maneuver as he trapped the loyalist Astartes between two waves of traitor Astartes, resulting in devastating mass casualties. As the black-armored Raven Guard faced a relentless volley from their enemies, Primarch Lorgar commanded his word-bearers to exploit a vulnerability in the Raven Guard's unprotected flanks. In response, Lord Corax, the master of the Raven Guard, charged in headlong into the ranks of the traitorous word-bearers. His form would become a blur of charcoal armor and black blades, cutting through the enemies of the Imperium with a ferocity that seemed to defy belief. Despite the objections of his advisors Corferon and Erebus, Lorgar disregarded their counsel and, propelled by reckless ambition, he himself, one of the weaker Primarchs, sprinted across the churned earth, littered with the bodies of the fallen from his brother's legion, in order to confront Corax. A fight in which victory seemed utterly unattainable, the two Primarchs would clash with relentless intensity. Corax fought with lethal intent, driven by the need of the survival of his legion, while Lorgar, a scholar at heart, struggled to merely endure. In this ferocious exchange, Corax utilized his superior speed, agility, and decades of combat experience to gain the upper hand. Lorgar's inexperience as a warrior would soon become evident, and in a swift motion, Corax impaled him through the stomach, the blades of the Raven Lord emerging from his back. As Corax moved to deliver the fatal blow with one of his other functioning lightning claws, he was interrupted by the sudden intervention of Konrad Curze. Weakened from the fierce battle with Lorgar, Corax seized a fleeting moment of distraction, igniting his jump pack and expending almost the entirety of its precious fuel reserves to escape Curze's grasp, soaring skyward amidst the echoing laughter of the Night Hunter. Meanwhile, tragedy would strike the Iron Hands. Cut off and surrounded, their forces almost utterly annihilated at the hands of their enemy. Even the elite Morlock Terminators were slaughtered, and their Primarch Ferrus Manus met a horrifying end, beheaded by Fulgrim. The Raven Guard and the Salamanders could do little to assist their brothers, as they found themselves in a desperate retreat, suffering severe and heavy losses in the process. Those Thunderhawks and Stormbird gunships that had managed to lift off from Isstvan were far outnumbered by those who had originally landed. Corax, though alive, was severely wounded, while the fate of Vulcan remained rather shrouded in uncertainty for quite some time. As the remaining forces of the Iron Hands arrived at the battlefield, they were met with the grim reality that their fallen brothers had been all but slaughtered, witnessing the deaths of their veterans and their Primarch, while the Salamanders and the Raven Guard had been reduced to a mere shadow of their former glory. And in part, much of this was precipitated by the actions of the Night Hunter. In the tumult of the Horus Heresy, it seems the War Master Horus Lupercal strategically chose to deploy Konrad Curze, along with his 8th Legion, to initiate a campaign of extermination against the Imperium's strongholds, in particular those of Hiroldar and Tharmos, located in the Aegis subsector of the eastern fringes. This brutal offensive was intended to secure Horus's flanks, while simultaneously delaying the Dark Angel's legion by sacrificing many Night Lords to the meat grinder, keeping the first from reinforcing the Loyalists. What unfolded over nearly 3 standard years was a bitterly contested campaign marked by significant bloodshed and strategic maneuvering. As part of this campaign, the Night Hunter devised a devastatingly cunning plan to sway his brother, Lionel Johnson, to Horus's cause. He positioned a deep void beacon along a partial route of one of the Dark Angel's Outrider vessels, and this beacon was ingeniously set to transmit coordinates in advance, facilitating the potential meeting between Primarchs on the planet Sangulsa. Curze's aim was to psychologically and physically dominate his brother, hoping to manipulate Lionel Johnson into submission, much like he had done to many a world before. This meeting would commence with an atmosphere of civility, as the two Primarchs exchanged pleasantries, each accompanied by two warriors of their respective honor guards. However, apparently, the atmosphere quickly deteriorated when the Night Haunter, unable to restrain his darker impulses, slandered Lionel Johnson. In a flash of fury, the Lion retaliated, striking his former brother. This situation escalated rapidly, erupting into a climactic brawl between the two. During this fray, the Night Haunter, fueled by rage and desire to overpower his brother, found himself strangling the life out of Lionel Johnson. Yet fate intervened as one of the Dark Angel Honor Guard plunged his sword into Curze's back in a desperate act that saved the Lion's life. This would lead to both legions scrambling to send in reinforcements in response to this violent encounter, as the Honor Guard, rather than continuing their fight and potentially risking the deaths of their Primarchs, dragged them from the scene and out of combat as soon as humanly possible. Remarkably, both Curze and Lionel Johnson survived, and they would continue to lead their legions in a fierce contest for dominance over the Aegis sector. In the year 009 M31, the war between the Night Lords and the Dark Angels reached a rather crucial turning point. The Dark Angels, under the command of their Primarch, executed a meticulously planned ambush of the Night Lords' fleet as it traversed the Aegis subsector. This divisive confrontation shattered the backbone of the Night Lords' Legion, leaving Primarch Konrad Curze mortally wounded after facing his brother in combat once again. The assault was characterized by precision and strategic brilliance, which resulted in unbelievable losses for the Night Lords, as dozens of capital ships were utterly and completely destroyed, and approximately 1/4 of their legion fleet was lost in the onslaught. Despite the magnitude of this defeat, a significant portion of the Night Lords' fleet managed to escape the Dark Angel's wrath, retreating into the darkness of space. As the remnants of the Night Lords sought refuge, the recently recovered Night Haunter led a desperate counteroffensive, orchestrating a boarding action against the Dark Angel's flagship, the Invincible Reason. Accompanied by his first captain, Sevatron, and his elite armamenter Terminators, Curze launched a rather ferocious attack. However, the engagement proved catastrophic, resulting in the deaths of nearly all but a dozen of his Terminator cadre, and the capture of his second-in-command, along with the few remaining survivors. In a twist of fate, Curze himself would manage to elude the Lion's forces, retreating into the very bowels of the mighty capital ship. For months, he would become a specter, haunting the corridors of the Invincible Reason, sowing chaos amongst the mortal crew and slaying a myriad of Astartes, all the while using the ship's complex layout to his advantage, as he would successfully evade every hunter-killer teams that were sent by the Lion to capture him, decimating several squads of Dark Angels in the process. The Lion himself, undeterred by the challenges of the Night Haunter, took upon the pursuit of his brother personally. For the next 16 weeks, he would stalk Curze through the vastness of the Invincible Reason, but the Night Haunter proved to be too elusive, slipping through the shadows and remaining just out of reach. Eventually, the surviving members of the Night Lords managed to regroup and to effect their escape, vanishing into the void, leaving behind a tale of treachery, vengeance, and the enduring enmity between these two legions, one that remains to this day. As the Ruin Storm unleashed its unrelenting fury, it would obscure the Astronomicon, rendering warp travel nearly impossible. In this chaotic landscape, the Imperium found itself effectively severed. The Dark Angels, realizing their predicament, that they could not return to Terra and aid in its defense, even with the Tchula engine, would be left in a rather tough bind. Amidst the turmoil, it seemed a glimmer of hope emerged, as the Dark Angels managed to lock onto a beacon of an extraordinary alien device known as a Pharos. Located within the world of Sotha, this beacon guided the First Legion's fleet safely through the warp and directly to the realm of Ultramar and its capital world of Macragge. Upon their arrival, they were met by Reboot Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, along with the Great Angel Sanguinius, the esteemed leader of the Blood Angels, who had also been guided by the Pharos. Together, these three Primarchs would play a pivotal role in establishing something known as Imperium Secundus, a new order intended to continue the fight against the traitors and save some modicum of the Emperor's grand vision. In a monumentous declaration, Guilliman would proclaim Sanguinius as the rightful heir to the Emperor, appointing him as the ruler of Imperium Secundus. Lionel Johnson would be then designated as Lord Protector of this nascent empire and placed in command of all military forces, effectively a title that mirrored the War Master. However, the formation of Imperium Secundus would soon be overshadowed by the chaos of Konrad Curze, as he had escaped the Invincible Reason in order to unleash a wave of terror across Macragge, all the while being intent on spreading fear and destruction. His rampage would draw the ire of both Guilliman and L. Johnson, who would confront the cornered Primarch in an attempt to end his threat once and for all. Yet Curze, ever cunning, had set up a trap. Using planted explosives, he collapsed an entire chapel upon the two Primarchs, allowing him to evade capture once again. Their lives hung in the balance until the timely intervention of warsmith Barbara Stantiok of the Iron Warriors, who was in communications with Guilliman during the attack, acted on instinct, reaching through a portal opened by the Ferris itself, pulling both loyalist Primarchs to safety on Sotha, just as the chapel's great weight crashed down. This act not only saved their lives, but also foiled Konrad Curze's expertly laid out plan. Nestled on the fringes of the galaxy, the remote world of Sotha teetered on the brink of the eastern fringe, bordering both the fiefdom of the 500 worlds of Ultramar and the vast expanse of Imperial territory, which was as of then unclaimed by any of the other Primarchs. Beneath the towering Mount Pharos, the Ultramarines uncovered the monumental apparatus crafted by an unknown Xenos species. This arcane structure had served multiple purposes, as it acted as both a beacon and a route finder, while enabling instantaneous communications across unfathomable distances faster than astropathic communication or any other type of communication available, cutting even through the thick turbulence of the ruin storm. In the aftermath of their defeat at the hands of the Dark Angels, the remnants of the Night Lords followed this beacon through the warp, ultimately finding themselves upon Sotha. Over several months, they would conduct the covert surveillance of the Ultramarines, scrutinizing their every movement and uncovering the true nature of the mysterious device known as the Ferris. Emboldened by this intelligence, the Night Lords executed a sudden assault on the lightly defended world. Intent on seizing control of the Ferris, their goal was twofold: to locate their flagship, the Nightfall, and to discover the whereabouts of their elusive Primarch, Konrad Curze. The ensuing battle was rather chaotic. The loyalist Iron Warriors who had defected and were under the command of warsmith Barbara Stantiok faced overwhelming odds against the Night Lords. In a selfless act of bravery, Stantiok resolved to overload the Ferris. This sacrificial decision, made with the intention of rendering the device's potential empathic abilities unusable by the Night Lords, thwarting their plans and denying them critical strategic advantages. However, the ramifications of Stantiok's sacrifice would echo through the corridors of history, though the true extent of its impact on the galaxy would not be realized for another 10 millennia. In this decisive confrontation on Sotha, the clash between the Night Lords and the Loyalists would be the point in history that would assure the doom of many, as this destruction necessitated by the Night Lords' actions led to the Tyranids taking note of the galaxy. So in reality, the Night Lords are largely to blame for the Tyranids' threat to humanity and all sentient races. In the ongoing pursuit of the elusive Night Hunter, Lion L. Johnson and Rabut Guilliman found themselves at an impasse. Their conflicting policies regarding the security of Imperium Secundus created a rather sizable rift between them. Tensions escalated in the wake of self-termination bombings that targeted an Astartes convoy, heightening the Lion's resolve to bring this chaos under control. Believing that Curze was hiding within the rebellious Illithium region of Ultramar, the Lion pushed for the use of drastic measures, a massive orbital saturation bombardment aimed at eliminating his brother once and for all. However, resistance arose from both Emperor Sanguinius and Guilliman, who were wary of the collateral damage such an act would incur. Instead of pursuing his original plan, the Lion opted to deploy his legion's Dreadwing to flush out Curze and quell the insurgents by any means necessary. The pivotal moment of this confrontation would come during the assault of the city Alma Mons, where the Lion finally cornered the elusive Primarch of the Night Lords. Their ensuing confrontation was brutal, with each combatant fighting with the full weight of their tragic destinies. Ultimately, the Lion would emerge victorious, confronting Curze about his betrayal of the Emperor. To this, Curze's chilling response was, "Why not?" which to the Lion encapsulated his brother's descent into madness. He described a ruthless monster dwelling within his mind, a manifestation of his frayed and fractured psyche that drove him away from all his former loyalties. Despite having Curze at his mercy, the Lion hesitated to deliver a finishing blow. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of fury upon his brother, stripping Curze of his backpack and raising him above his head, then bringing him crashing down across his bented knee, an act that shattered Curze's spine and left him paralyzed for now. With the Night Haunter grievously wounded, the Lion presented him before Sanguinius and Guilliman for his trial. During the subsequent triumph, Curze attempted to defend his actions, adamantly refusing to acknowledge any guilt. He posited that each Primarch was designed to fulfill a specific purpose, a role if you will, and that he was merely acting in accordance to his intrinsic nature. Therefore, no crimes had been committed. Seeing as this was failing in a calculated move, Curze further exacerbated the division between Guilliman and the Lion by accusing the latter of secretly ordering a orbital bombardment, a direct contraversion of Guilliman's established orders. Enraged by this accusation, the Lion sought to extract vengeance on Curze, but his path was obstructed by the interventions of Sanguinius, who urged restraint, emphasizing the need for justice over revenge. In a moment that would resonate throughout the Horus Heresy, overcome with fury, Guilliman would seize the Lion's sword and break it upon his thigh, an act that underscored the deeply fractious nature between the Primarchs. However, Sanguinius, understanding the broader implications of their discord, dismissed the Lord Protector, thereby bringing the triumph to an abrupt end. This decision bore significant weight and would result in the Lion's banishment from Imperium Secundus. In the hours that followed, the Dark Angels would withdraw from a crag, with Lionel Johnson consumed by contemplation. Within the chamber of the titula engine, he brooded over his actions throughout the preceding decades, as he grappled with the consequences of his banishment of Luther and the death of Namil, along with other decisions that haunted him. These reflections revealed an inner turmoil simmering beneath his stoic exterior. As preparations for their return to Caliban unfolded, the Lion felt an undeniable pull in the back of the titula's engine's chambers. In a decisive moment, he ordered the ancient teleportation device to teleport him and Hologen, the Deathbringer, and Lieutenant of the Deathwing, back to Macragge. Their arrival was rather dramatic, as Sanguinius was poised to execute Curze at that very moment for his myriad of crimes. Just at that moment, the Lion and his lieutenant materialized directly into the chamber, imploring Sanguinius to halt his execution. The suddenness of their intrusion was met with resistance as troops flooded the room, demanding the Lion's surrender. Yet Lionel Johnson stood firm, articulating the rationale behind his daring act. He explained that Curze possessed an unwavering ability to foresee potential futures through his precognitive visions, which included an ominous prophecy that his own death would come at the hands of an assassin dispatched by the Emperor. The Lion posited that if this were true, it served as proof that the Emperor was alive, a notion that had sparked hope amidst the prevailing despair. Sanguinius, who had been burdened by his own precognitive insights regarding his inevitable demise, would recognize the validity in the Lion's claims, as his own visions had not changed. The interweaving of their forces became apparent as the weight of their choices loomed large over them. When Reboot Guilliman would inquire about Curze's fate, the Lion knelt before his two brothers, in a gesture that signified both humility and resolve. He vowed to take the mantle as Curze's guardian, a promise that would echo throughout the chambers, signifying a sudden shift in responsibility. His crippling defeat at the hands of Lionel Johnson, the twisted and fearsome Konrad Curze remained a chained prisoner aboard the Invincible Reason. Despite his regeneration from the brutal spinal injury inflicted upon him during their last encounter, the Night Lord's Primarch was never fully cooperative. The Lion, seeking to gain valuable insight through Curze's gift of precognition, would visit him periodically, hoping to extract any useful information, which he would be able to aid the Loyalists with in their war against Horus. But time and time again, Curze only offered cryptic taunts and dark riddles, frustrating any attempts to use his visions for the good of humanity. As the Ultramarines, Dark Angels, and Blood Angels fleets, commanded by Reboot Guilliman, Lionel Johnson, and Sanguinius respectively, attempted to breach the Ruinstorm to reach Terra, the Night Haunter remained a prisoner. His chaotic mind was an asset that none of his captors were able to reliably access. Then Sanguinius experienced a vision, one that led him to believe his destiny would be found on the world of Davin, the infamous world where Horus Lupercal had first fallen to chaos. In an unexpectedly risky move, Sanguinius ventured aboard the Invincible Reason and took the chained Curze with him, intending to test the Night Haunter's belief in the inevitability of fate. As Sanguinius led Curze off the Dark Angel's vessel, the Primarch of the Blood Angels had to forcibly subdue the Dark Angel's guards in order to take Curze with him, much to the Lion's fury. The Lion, in his rage over the assault on his warriors, nearly decided to obliterate Davin itself by unleashing cyclonic torpedoes, an act that would have doomed the entire planet. But ultimately, the Lion, along with Guilliman, chose to follow Sanguinius and Curze to the surface of Davin, where they would face the cursed world together, in what would later become known as the Second Battle of Davin. The four Primarchs would venture into the Temple of the Serpent's Lodge, the very site where Horus had first turned to chaos. Here, Curze's conviction in every moment in fate being a fixed point began to waver. He had foreseen none of these events, and Sanguinius would turn to him and claim that destiny could indeed be changed, and showed himself to stand in dark contrast to everything that Curze believed in. The Night Haunter's dark certainty would then begin to crumble. The situation would grow even more dire as a massive demon known as Medal would appear and drag Sanguinius through a warp portal. For the first time in his existence, Curze showed genuine concern for his brother Primarch's fate. Strangely distraught, the Night Haunter confessed to Guilliman and the Lion that he had had no vision of how to save Sanguinius, admitting that his once terrifying and almost certain foresight had utterly failed him. As more and more warp-spawned demons erupted across the surface of Davin, Curze, overcome with despair, was dragged back to the Invincible Reason, where his usefulness seemed to wane further and further still. Following the Battle of Davin, the Ruinstorm temporarily began to dissipate, offering a clear path through the warp towards Terra. However, Horus's traitor fleets still blockaded the path. Then a new plan would be formed. Guilliman and the Lion would act in order to distract Horus's forces, while Sanguinius would race towards Terra. The Lord of the Blood Angels knew that his destiny and his final moments awaited him on the throne world. With this decision made, Sanguinius would take custody of Curze and transferred him aboard his flagship, the Red Terror. The plan was to bring the Night Haunter to Terra, where he would face the Emperor's judgment, but before reaching Terra, Sanguinius would make a drastic decision. Believing that Curze's prophecy, foreseeing his own death at the hands of an Imperial assassin, was an unchangeable fixed point in reality, Sanguinius declared that Curze must now follow his own path to that destiny. And despite having a potential vision of Curze being able to beg the Emperor for forgiveness and change his own fate, Sanguinius' own foresight allowed him to see that this outcome would be the worst one for humanity. To ensure that fate would follow in a way that would protect humanity, Sanguinius placed Curze into a stasis coffin, a method that would effectively halt time for the Night Haunter while he floated through the void of space. Sanguinius would proclaim that Curze's ultimate end at the hands of M. Shen, the Imperial assassin, would come when destiny willed it. Until then, Curze would drift through the cosmos, awaiting the inevitable fulfillment of his grim vision. In one final act of defiance, Curze would rage against his fate, but it was too little and too late. His protestations were in vain. Sealed within a stasis coffin, the Night Haunter was launched into the cold, endless void of space, as the Blood Angels continued their race towards Terra, leaving Curze to his fate, facing the long, haunting silence, which foretold his own demise. Thus, Konrad Curze, a figure of tragedy and terror, would be cast into the stars, his fate suspended yet unbroken, tied to the final stroke of an assassin's blade, a fate both foreseen and inevitable, yet unreachable for millennia. Following the closing of the Horus Heresy, Konrad Curze, the Night Lord's fearsome Primarch, cast into the void of space, Curze was left to await his prophesied death at the hands of an Imperial assassin. But the story of the Night Hunter did not end with his banishment into the stars. Years later, the coffin was discovered by an Imperial salvage ship, the Sheldron, as it traversed through the vastness of space. The crew was unaware of the dark, dangerous occupant within and chose to break the coffin's surface, inadvertently awaking Curze from his deathless slumber. But the crew was not alone. Hidden amongst their ranks was an assassin from the Caladius Temple, only known as Gun, who had been sent to eliminate the Night Hunter once and for all. What followed was a massacre, fueled by unrelenting rage, as Curze unleashed his misbegotten fury upon the Sheldron's crew, slaughtering all but 2 survivors, Gun, the assassin, and the lone crewman known as Elver. The assassin, though skilled and rather deadly, ultimately met his fate at the hands of the Night Hunter. However, before his death, Gun was able to alert the Caladius Temple of Curze's general location, setting in motion the events that would lead to the final chapter of the Night Lord's Primarch's fate. Elver, the only remaining crewman, could be said to have been spared by Curze, though not for reasons of mercy. Instead, the Night Hunter enslaved the man, slowly tearing away at the man's flesh for his own sick and twisted enjoyment, all the while forcing the mutilated human to navigate his ship and endure years of torment upon the hands of Curze's sick and twisted mind. The Sheldron, lacking a warp drive, was on a slow 4-year journey to the planet known as Sagasula. This was the last known bastion of the Night Lords. Through this arduous voyage, Elver became more than a simple servant. He became the Night Hunter's unwilling student, subjected to all of Curze's dark philosophies and nihilistic worldview. Over time, Elver gained a unique and disturbing insight into the mind of his captor. What he discovered was surprising. Despite his outward conviction, Curze harbored a deep-seated doubt about the truth of his own precognitive vision. Some of his visions had driven his actions and shaped his destructive beliefs in a predestined fate. Eventually, Elver came to realize that Curze's relentless brutality, his obsessive adherence to his visions, might have been born from fear rather than certainty. This revelation, however, would never see the light of day. Upon their arrival to Sangulsa, where Curze rendezvoused with a force of Night Lords under the command of Talos Volcaran, the Night Hunter took swift action to eliminate any potential threat to his dark legacy and his image. Fearing Elver's insight might undermine his authority or expose his inner turmoil, Curze ordered the Night Lords to kill his slave, ensuring that the very secret of his doubts would die with him. Having rejoined his legion, Curze's future remained uncertain, but his past continued to haunt him. His doubts about the truth of his visions cast a shadow over the man, once thought to be certain of his own fate, as the specter of his prophesied death loomed ever larger. The Night Hunter's final days became a haunting reflection of the darkness he had so long embraced. His life, marked by violence, fear, and a twisted sense of justice, would come to an end not through battle, but through the hands of an assassin, the very one he had foreseen. As it seems, in the end of the siege of Terra and the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords did not follow the chaotic path of many other traitor legions in the retreat into the Eye of Terror. Instead, they continued their relentless campaign against the Imperium, carving out a reign of terror amongst the worlds of the eastern fringes of the galaxy. Yet beneath their veneer of defiance lay a troubling transformation. As the Legion exhibited signs of a self-destructive disposition, the Night Hunter's demise had a profound impact on the Legion, as Konrad gradually succumbed to madness and despair. Once a Primarch who commanded respect through his imposing presence and his razor-sharp intellect, Curze's sanity slowly eroded just prior to his final days. He often erupted into fits of violence and incoherent rants, exhibiting a sadism that deeply unsettled even his sons who were around him the most. Members of his inner circle, particularly Jago Sevatron, witnessed the tragic decline, their hearts growing disheartened alongside their leader's disintegration. Recognizing the threat the Night Lords posed, it seems the Emperor sought to eliminate them once and for all. In a decisive move, the Emperor's will dispatched the Caladius Temple of Assassins, with one of their number, known as Shen, eventually succeeding in the assassination of Konrad Curze. Following Curze's death, the Night Lords splintered into rival warbands, a fate all too common amongst those who willingly served chaos, as infighting consumed the Legion, leading to them eventually retreating into the Eye of Terror, where their number and capabilities steadily deteriorated over the millennia. By the 41st millennium, the once mighty Legion had fragmented over and over again, and with no clear leadership, several ambitious commanders vied for supremacy over their fractured forces. Despite the internal strife, the Night Lords have seemingly found a way to survive in this chaotic landscape, as they have become mercenaries, selling their services as elite shock troops to various factions within the Chaos Pantheon, and even to pirates raiding Imperial worlds, including the notorious figure known as Huron Blackheart. Their allegiance remains as ever fluid as water, often aligning with Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, during his Black Crusade campaigns as they seek to slake their own brand of bloodlust and vengeance against the Imperium. One of the Night Lord's most infamous raids post-heresy occurred on the world of Scoundrel's Fall, located just a few hundred light years from Holy Terra. This brutal incursion would showcase their unyielding commitment to terror tactics despite their Primarch's essential fall from grace, and they displayed how their brutal tactics would continue to sow a legacy of chaos and cruelty throughout the galaxy evermore. As the Night Lords, they remained a testament to the destructive power and ambition of their Primarch. Their journey, though marked by their Primarchs, was now also marked by his absence. Some of the most notable conflicts that the Night Lords would take part in would be, first, the Eastern Fringe Genocide, which marked a dark chapter in the Imperium's history, and it occurred sometime during the late 31st millennium, in the aftermath of Horus's defeat during the Siege of Terra, as the traitor legions were driven into the Eye of Terror, seeking refuge from the vengeful forces of the Imperium. However, due to the Night Lords not following their fellow traitors, they, following their devastating losses at the Great Crusade, chose not to splinter or separate into warbands as of yet. Instead, they embarked on a coordinated campaign of genocide and terror against the Imperium, unleashing wave after wave of violence and brutality, which remains unparalleled in its macabre bloodlust. This catastrophic campaign was driven by a growing sense of self-destructive hatred that pervaded the entire Night Lords. It seems like they were suffering a psychological malaise that mirrored the inner turmoil of their Primarch. The Night Lords' rampage across the Eastern Fringe was largely characterized by acts of extreme cruelty and calculated terror, as they sought to instill fear and chaos amongst the Imperial populace. As their relentless assaults continued unabated, that is, until the assassination of Konrad Curze, and it seems that the Caladius assassin Shen essentially curtailed the Night Lord's reign of terror. Years later, in 832 M33, the Night Lord's dark legacy would once again rise up in the form of the Predilector, a chaos warlord who had once belonged to their legion. In a desperate bid for power, he forged a pact with the ruinous powers of the Warp, intending to ascend to the place of Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided. In order to appease these malevolent entities for his new immortality, he would orchestrate a horrific sacrificial ritual which claimed the lives of uncountable Imperial souls. Amongst these victims were Imperial Monasterum missionaries and members of the Adeptus Sororitas, all who were slowly and methodically sacrificed to the dark gods in a grotesque display of devotion. This macabre offering pleased the ruinous powers, granting the Predilector the dark apotheosis he so sought. Up next would be in 843 M34, when the Night Lords once again left their mark with the culling of Grendel's world, an event that saw the systematic extermination of the entire planetary population of Grendel, situated in the Yasulbul cloud near the far eastern fringe of the galaxy. Grendel's world fell victim to the Legion's brutal efficiency, as essentially they were used as a way to test new and methodical approaches to eradicating life on a planet. Up next would be in 220 M38, where in another harrowing chapter of vile maliciousness, a Night Lord's warband executed a devastating ambush against Chapter Master Orlando Furioso of the Howling Griffins at Eros Point. Under the command of the Predilector and his chosen, the Night Lords utilized a series of assaults from Deathclaw assault boats to board the Chapter Master's starship, overwhelming the defenders and forcing them to evacuate using Thunderhawks and drop pods. The battle would rage on the surface of Eros Quintus, where the elite forces of the Howling Griffins were faced with overwhelming odds. Chapter Master Furioso and the entirety of the First Company would fall in combat, marking a significant blow against Loyalist forces. In a final act of desecration, the Night Lords mounted Furioso's body on the prow of his Thunderhawk, transmitting its location system-wide. Eventually, the remnants of the Chapter Master would be discovered a month later by other Howling Griffin Astartes, in a grim reminder of the brutality that the Night Lords had inflicted and would continue to inflict upon the Imperium forevermore. Then would come the event known as the False Saviors of Gragos. During an unknown date in M41, it would seem the Night Lords, in collaboration with the Alpha Legion, intervened in a conflict on the agri mining world of Gragos Entrenchment, which was on the brink of being completely overrun by the brutal Kurscherbach. This seemingly benevolent force, clad in colors and insignias of Loyalist Space Marines, would bring a fleeting sense of hope to the beleaguered populace and the struggling defenders. For several blissful days, the inhabitants believed that they had been saved from annihilation. However, once the orcs had been driven off, the grim reality had emerged. They had merely exchanged one set of oppressors for another, and the true malevolence of their new saviors would soon reveal itself, plunging the populace of Gragos into a far darker fate than that which the orcs had offered them. At another unknown date in M41, yet again a harrowing echo of history made itself known, when the Imperial frigate Hand of Mercy responded to a residual distress call from Grendel's world, which had been sent in the 34th millennium. Upon their arrival, they discovered the true horror, as they had been witness to the relentless brutality where every living human had been hunted down and their corpses marked with symbols which unmistakably identified them as victims of the Night Lords. Though the planet would later be resettled a century later and the massacre became a mere folktale, however, it seems that not everything was as good as it could be, since in the 41st millennium a second massacre would unfold in an almost exact mirror of the original. This horrifying reoccurrence prompted a full-scale crusade which was led by the Mortifactors chapter of Space Marines, who mobilized their fastest ships seeking vengeance against those responsible for this atrocity. During an unknown date in M41, amidst a relentless tide of violence, the Night Lord's warmonger Avruk's wrath began to grapple with disillusionment. Growing rather wary of his indiscriminate slaughter, he vowed to embody the early ideals of his Primarch, seeking to punish only those who he deemed deserving of his wrath. Initially, this shift granted him a semblance of peace, as he engaged in acts of retribution and calculated severity, ensuring that none dare stray from the path of righteousness. However, his rather fragile moral compass would eventually shatter, leading him back into a maelstrom of mindless brutality, and within a standard year, he descended fully into chaos once more, enacting horrifying atrocities for offenses as minor as breaches of shipping contracts or even mispronunciation of High Gothic. Eventually, wrath madness spiraled into one which reflected the inseparable corruption inherent in the legacy of the Night Lords. Unfortunately, even this being their best chance for redemption was doomed for failure. At another unknown date in M41, the Night Lords would commit a series of audacious assaults led by Gilhost Vent, who executed crippling hit-and-run attacks on orbital way stations and macrofiber facelifts surrounding the notorious world of Chokehold. These raids were meticulously planned out and executed, allowing them to escape with vast quantities of ammunition and fully charged power units. Moreover, they were able to seize dozens of new recruits, further augmenting their ranks. The attacks on Chokehold exemplified the Night Lord's ruthless efficiency, despite being corrupted by the Siren Song of Chaos. Later, in 750 M41, in pursuit of the possessed Chaos cruiser Shadeblight, the Night Lords unleashed a wave of terror throughout the Ango subsector, initially met with resistance from the Red Wolves chapter, the Night Lords would wreak havoc across the sector in a quest for the power that the ship would provide. However, the Red Wolves would ultimately succeed in thwarting the Night Lords' ambitions, denying them the prize they so desperately sought. The next event of galactic scale would be the Khazizan uprisings. In 968 M41, the Night Lords would commit a rather well-calculated assault during the public holiday on the Imperial agri-world of Khazizan, where the Night Lords, along with traitor planetary defense forces and numerous chaos cultists, ignited the Khazizan uprisings, exploiting the fact that over half of the planetary defense force was actively on leave at the time. The beleaguered world found itself besieged on all fronts. The cultists, aiming to harness otherworldly powers, attempted to summon demons to bolster their own ranks. However, due to Khazizan's significant distance from the Eye of Terror and the outright lack of devotion from the Night Lords, the number of summoned demons was disappointingly small for the amount of sacrifice. Eventually, the Night Lords' Chaos Champion, Gorsmeth, led an attack against the 122nd Cadian Shock Troopers, commanded by Captain Fane. Utilizing warp magics, due to being aided by Chaos Sorcerer Azurmundurus, they were able to misdirect and incapacitate the defenders, culminating in a disastrous defeat. Captain Fane and his entire company would perish violently while defending an Adeptus Arbites precinct house. The stronghold of chaos over Khazizan was only broken with the arrival of the Imperial Fist, who were able to ruthlessly eliminate every last traitor and restore order to the world. At a later date in M41, a small flotilla of Night Lord ships would be able to navigate through the Cadian Gate, spending months evading detection within the warp. Their target was an unassuming planet known as Scoundrel's Fall, which had previously been attacked and resettled. Situated merely 100 light years from Terra and home to a significant Scholera Progenium Abbey, this world was a vital training grounds for the future Imperial military officers, along with Inquisitors, Commissars, Stormtroopers, and Sisters of Battle. After 7 days of relentless fighting, there would be no survivors left from the Night Lord's merciless assault, as the butchered remnants of both defenders and attackers were arranged in talismanic patterns intended to assist in the summoning of a demonic horde. This unleashed chaos would rampage across half the world, while the Night Lords made their escape towards the Eye of Terror, deftly avoiding the pursuit of Imperial warships, using the summoned demon as a distraction. The audacity of said assault sent shockwaves through the military structure of Segmentum Solar, resulting in the court-martial and penitent exile of Lord Commander Solar Jackson. In 999 M41, an event known as the Fall of Villamus would occur, when the notorious Red Corsairs, having struck a deal with a Chaos Champion known as the Exalted, led an assault spearheaded by a substantial Night Lord's warband against the lightly defended fortress monastery of the Marines' Errant chapter. Their objective was to seed a vast cache of gene seeds stored within the fortress monastery. Following a brutal conflict, the Night Lords and the Red Corsairs would turn against each other, with the Night Lords attempting to reclaim their strike cruiser known as the Echo of Damnation, alongside with all the recovered gene seed. This infighting was not only an example of chaos, but an example of what little respect the Night Lords held in the Red Corsairs, and it would cost them. The next, and potentially the most impactful event that the Night Lords would take a part in, would be the 13th Black Crusade, occurring in 999 M41, where in the climactic moment of chaos, War Master Abaddon the Despoiler launched his 13th Black Crusade, which aimed at facilitating a second invasion of Terra. As a part of this unified offensive, shock troops drawn from the Night Lords sowed terror all across the Sakuras sector, ruthlessly cutting communications and displaying the corpses of their fallen victims from every building within reach. The Night Lords would execute innumerable acts of terror, performing lightning raids and cunning feints to gradually dismantle Imperial defenses in the region. Even the most stalwart defenders of the Imperium, who maintained unwavering faith within their belief of the God Emperor, found their resolve shattering amidst the psychological warfare characterized by the Night Lords' operation. Amongst these incidents was a campaign of heretical transmissions falsely alleging that the Dark Angels chapter of Space Marines were in league with the forces of chaos. In part, this was due to utilizing knowledge gathered from the Fallen. Eventually, an Ordo Malleus kill team was dispatched to eliminate the source of these broadcasts, only to discover the fallen bodies of the Night Lords serving as evidence of the Dark Angels' righteous fury at their honor being thumbed. During the same crusade, Chapter Master Alvaro of the Howling Griffins diverted his battle barge, the Sword of Destiny, from the larger war effort to pursue the Night Lord's demon prince known as the Predilector, seeking vengeance for the death of Orlando Furioso, millennia prior. In a titanic space battle, the Howling Griffins' First Company and the Predilector's chosen warband led to the victory of the Howling Griffins, as they restored their honor by banishing the demon prince back to the furthest depths of the warp. Meanwhile, the Night Lord's war leader, Chaos Lord Trekka Darkblood, suffered a crippling blow when his Styx heavy cruiser was damaged by the Imperial Navy in the Fabrius Straits. Fortunately, a substantial force of Chaos warships eventually rescued the drifting starship and its enraged occupants, enabling the Night Lords to continue their dark endeavors unimpeded. Later, in M42, during an event known as the Empire of Fields, and in the aftermath of Cadia's fall during the 13th Black Crusade, the Great Rift unleashed a wave of panic and madness throughout the galaxy, one which allowed the Night Lords to thrive amidst the turmoil, with many Night Lords establishing small stellar empires in the star systems severed from the Emperor's light during a period known as the Noctis Athrena. The chaos and disarray became fertile grounds for the malevolent ambitions of the Night Lords, allowing them to further entrench the reign of terror across the galaxy. The Night Lords now had an opportunity to ingrain their legacy of horror unabated, as they entwined their fate with the relentless tides of chaos now sweeping across the Imperium. Eventually, in M42, within the shadows of the Cicatrix Maledictum, navigator guilds discerned a temporary channel of real space, leading from the Corinth system to the foreboding Imperium Nihilus. This was a rare opportunity which prompted several Imperial fleets to make haste as they departed to traverse this treacherous passage. However, unbeknownst to them, the Night Lords had orchestrated the illusion of safety within this region, their demonic pacts facilitating the perilous navigation for the Imperials. And as the Imperial vessels plunged within the Great Rift, the Night Lords chose the perfect time to assault them from all sides. Through a series of boarding actions, the Night Lords captured dozens of Imperial ships, leaving the fleets vulnerable to further predations and the onslaughts of chaos. In the early days of the Noctis Athena, as the Astronomicon's guiding light was essentially extinguished, plunging countless star systems into utter chaos, more and more warbands of the Night Lords chose to make their mark, both within Imperium Nihilus and Imperium Sanctus. Eventually they would be pushed out of Sanctus, however not before events such as the Taldus War. The Taldus system, home to the sacred shrine world of Benediction, would become a rather important focal point when the Dark Apostle Corferon of the Wordbearers Legion launched a brutal and devastating assault. He would enlist a large number of Night Lords warbands, including the notorious warband commanded by Chaos Lord Yarus Kine, in order to augment his force in this new Dark War faith. Positioned aboard the battleship Nightmare of Sylinx, the Night Lords eagerly anticipated their share of the spoils of war, while relishing in the suffering they could inflict upon the pious followers of the Corpse Emperor. Before the Wordbearers unleashed their initial barrage upon Benediction, Yarus Kine's warband struck first, dispatching a kill team to the astropathic relay on the world of Starpool. Here they would butcher its unsuspecting occupants and detonate cyclonic charges all across the complex's core, obliterating vital communications arrays and essentially turning off most opportunities for them to contact the greater Imperium. As this heinous act unfolded, the Nightmare of Clinics emerged from the warp at the system's periphery. This accursed vessel held thousands of captured astropaths, bound to instruments of torment, overseen by the sinister warriors of the Night Lords, who would subject them and their wretched souls to horrific tortures, driving them into a state of perpetual pain-induced frenzy. Their psychic screams reverberated across the cosmos, disrupting long-range Vox communications and scrambling the minds of shipborne navigators. Imperial reinforcements would subsequently be dragged from the warp into the the Tears of the Emperor, a blazing asteroid field at the Rimworld's edge of the Taldos system. There, more Night Lords lay in wait, poised to feast on the terror and plunder that awaited them. As the conflict escalated, they clashed with a contingent of Vanguard Space Marines from the White Scars chapter within this asteroid belt, in a relentless campaign of hit-and-run tactics, which both forces used, leading to a stalemate, further heightening the brutal nature of this prolonged struggle in the war-torn system. Eventually, during the Iron Crusade, an event known as the Second Relief of Mordian would occur in M42, as the Imperial forces executed a strategic withdrawal from the Stygius sector. Amidst an ongoing invasion, the Iron Hands chapter defiantly refused to retreat. Instead, they assembled on the besieged world of Mordian, which had fallen prey to relentless chaos assaults, accompanied by a meager contingent of Mordian Iron Guard. The Iron Hands sought to reinvigorate their purpose, determined to purge the perceived weakness that had marred their earlier performance during the campaign. During a critical juncture, the Iron Hands, bolstered by a cadre of allies, outraged by the perceived defeatism exhibited by Imperial forces, would act. Amongst these were reinforcements from the Brazen Claws, Fire Lords, Silver Skulls, Sons of Medusa, and Iron Lords. Together, they would form what was known as the Iron Crusade. Upon their arrival, they discovered the world of the Mordians was ravaged by a warband of the Night Lords, commanded by the malevolent Arhak Deathshriek and his ferocious raptor hordes. Deathshriek's insidious strategy involved using the terror inflicted upon the Mordian populace to fuel a chaos ritual capable of dragging the entire world into the warp. In a display of characteristic bluntness, the Iron Hands and their allies launched a surprise assault, emerging from the warp to engage the traitor fleet stationed in orbit. They initiated a daring drop pod assault on Mordian's capital, spearheaded by Clan Abranai, led by Iron Captain Kenark Var, as Deathshriek relentlessly directed his chaos cultists against the Iron Hands. Var and his forces inflicted devastating losses upon their foes. One of the more pivotal moments would occur when Var confronted Deathshriek in single combat, inflicting grievous wounds upon the Chaos Commander. Despite their initial success, the Iron Hands would face a renewed assault from the Benedictine Guard and the Cult of the Whispered Word. The tide of the battle would quickly shift as renegade warlords across the sector united, recognizing the potential for the annihilation in its totality of the Iron Hands. The Loyalist assault began to falter under this mounting pressure as Darkshriek would proclaim victory and prepared to unleash the full might of his fleet upon the beleaguered Iron Hands in orbit, boasting an overwhelming numerical advantage of 3-1. However, the situation rapidly changed with the arrival of Iron Hands successor chapters upon the battlefield. Deathshriek's armada was caught off guard and in disarray by the Loyalist reinforcements, which caused them to face a catastrophic defeat. The newly arrived Loyalist warships unleashed orbital bombardments on Mordian's surface. While seemingly indiscriminate, it was far from chaotic in its execution. It followed the tactical doctrine known as Hammer and the Storm, which guided the Iron Hands' approach on the battlefield above and below. What appeared to have been a faltering advance was actually a calculated pause, allowing the Iron Hands tech marines to erect void shields and reinforce the capital city's remaining bunkers. Those in the capital, whom the Iron Hands deemed worthy of survival, weathered the brutal firestorm from above, while their adversaries, emboldened by the prospect of victory, had been rampaging across the streets, causing them to suffer devastating losses. Within the span of only one solar hour of bombardment, Chaos's grip upon Mordian was shattered. In the aftermath, additional reinforcements arrived from Crypta Mundi, enabling the Iron Hands not only to drive chaos from Mordian, but also to form a counterassault against the chaos garrisons on adjacent worlds, leading to the governing body of the Iron Hands, known as the Iron Council, to subsequently unleash a second phase of the campaign, aiming to eradicate the remaining chaos presence within the Mordian system and reclaim the vital refineries and orbital shipyards of the neighboring Carvel's system. As this campaign unfolds, the Iron Hands and their allies wage a war not only against the forces of chaos, but one of retribution, determined to restore Imperial order in the worlds that had been ravaged by the Night Lords. As the Era Indomitus dawned, the Night Lords were greatly benefited by the emergence of the Great Rift, and they greeted it with fervor. The Imperium Nihilus, now shrouded in an impenetrable darkness, severed from the guiding light of the Astronomicon, found itself vulnerable and isolated. Meanwhile, Imperium Sanctus temporarily descended into chaos and confusion, which all meant that it was fertile ground for the practical ambitions of the Night Lords' warbands, an atmosphere of anarchy, where the remnants of the Night Lords, having essentially devolved into a state of piracy and raiding, flourished in a manner previously thought impossible by the other Chaos warbands or the Imperium. Departmental Munitorum worlds were mercilessly stripped bare by midnight-clad marauders. Fortress-monasteries, once bastions of strength, became targets for the Night Lords' incursions, resulting in the theft of gene seed and the systematic looting of armories. The defenders of these strongholds suffering unimaginable fates, often mutilated and ritually slaughtered in displays of cruelty that instilled fear across the galaxy for a resurgence of the Night Lords. Compounding this horror, Chaos Sorcerers of the Night Lords devised increasingly insidious methods to exploit the weaknesses of humanity, as they employed diabolical strategies involving the abduction and torment of thousands of astropaths. Through this unmistakable cruelty, the sons of Konrad Curze have seemingly mastered the art of psychological trauma in ways that their sire could never imagine, using said trauma to generate siren signals and further deceptive signals to mislead and ensnare stranded Imperial vessels. This dark art was now not merely a tactic, but a systematic approach to terror that the Night Lords would execute on a grand scale. Entire worlds would become grotesque monuments to suffering and despairs. Whole rooms would be filled with stitched bodies, floor to ceiling, screaming living beings, in horrific displays that would even make the Dark Eldar believe they had gone too far. Their campaigns of terror would inflict more psychological trauma on the Imperium than any other traitor legion, despite militarily being at a significantly smaller scale, establishing a legacy that will now span for eons. And as the conflicts of the Era Indomitus escalate, and Dante's fleet nihilist begins to act with the collective power of a legion, it seems the frequency of the Night Lords' terror attacks would surge, reflecting their increasing unity, as they were no longer just scattered, but consolidating their power warband by warband, rallying under a dark and dire cause. For if they don't, they will be met by forces equivalent to the legions of old. For the worlds of mankind, this cohesion amongst the Night Lords has heralded an ominous fate. The shadow cast by their actions looms larger now than it ever has, threatening to engulf entire systems in an unending night of despair and destruction. As their malevolence spreads, the grim reality has set in. The Night Lords are no longer merely remnants of a fallen legion, but harbingers of doom all their own, ready to unleash their horrors upon the Imperium.